My parents skipped my grandfather's funeral to drink champagne on a luxury yacht in the Caribbean. While I stood shivering in the pouring rain watching his casket being lowered into the muddy ground, my mother posted a photo online celebrating being free of his dead weight. Less than an hour later, my phone lit up with an automated text message from my deceased grandfather's number telling me to go to his house immediately. He said there was something hidden under the washing machine. When I arrived, the front door was splintered open. My name is Sydney. I am 34 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect your family's legacy from the very people who were supposed to cherish it. The rain in Boston that morning was relentless, soaking right through my dark coat. I stood completely alone at the edge of the open grave. There were no other mourners, just me, the priest, and two cemetery workers waiting respectfully. My grandfather, Theodore, deserved a much better farewell than this bleak, lonely mourning. He was the only person in my family who had ever showed me genuine warmth. As the priest read the final prayer, my phone buzzed. The alert showed that my mother, Patricia, had just tagged my father, Richard, my younger sister, Madison, and her husband, DeAndre, in a new post. I wiped the raindrops from the screen. The image showed the four of them standing on the sun-drenched deck of a rented yacht in the Bahamas. They were all wearing designer resort wear and holding crystal champagne flutes. The caption my mother wrote felt like a physical slap across the face. It read, "Finally free of the dead weight. No more begging for handouts. Living our best life." I stared at the glowing screen, my vision blurring with a mixture of grief and pure anger. They had claimed they could not attend the funeral because they were too devastated to handle the emotional toll. Instead, they had booked a first-class vacation the moment Theodore's heart stopped beating. "Is anyone else joining us, miss?" the priest asked, gently pulling me back to the dreary reality of the graveyard. "No," I replied, my voice hard and steady. "It is just me. They are too busy celebrating." After the short service concluded, I followed the priest back to his car to handle the final arrangements. My father had promised he would wire the funds to the funeral director last week. Instead, the priest handed me an invoice showing a completely unpaid balance. I reached into my purse, pulled out my own credit card, and handed it to the priest to cover the burial fees out of my own pocket. "I am so sorry for the confusion," I told him, fighting to keep my composure. My parents liked to complain that my grandfather was a financial burden, but Theodore never asked them for a single dime. It was always them bleeding him dry. My father used my grandfather as a personal bank for years, and now he will not even pay to put him in the ground. The priest gave me a sympathetic nod, processed the payment, and handed me the receipt. I thanked him and walked back toward my car, the cold rain matching the icy resentment building inside my chest. I sat in the driver's seat of my car with the heater blasting. I was a forensic accountant. My entire career was built on untangling complicated financial webs and exposing corporate fraud. Yet I had never been able to untangle the toxic, entitled mess that was my own family. Madison had always been the golden child. Whatever she wanted, my parents provided. When she married DeAndre, a flashy guy who ran a questionable cryptocurrency investment firm, my parents treated him like royalty. DeAndre drove luxury cars and wore custom suits, but I knew a scam artist when I saw one. Just as I put the car in gear, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text message. The sender's name made my heart stop. It was from Theodore. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Theodore had passed away 3 days ago. I opened the message. It was clearly a scheduled text set up through an automated service to trigger after his death. The message read, "Sydney, sweetheart. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. Do not trust your parents. Go to my house right now. They do not know about the loose floorboard under the washing machine. Find what I left for you before they do." A chill ran down my spine. Theodore had lived in a small rundown house on the edge of the city. My parents constantly mocked his living conditions, using his modest home as proof that he was a failure. But Theodore was sharp. If he had scheduled an automated message to reach me after his death, something extremely important was hiding in that house. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the cemetery. The drive across town felt like hours. My mind raced with possibilities. What could he have hidden under a floorboard? Why was he so convinced my parents would be after it? I turned onto Theodore's quiet street and parked a few houses down. The rain was beginning to let up, leaving a thick gray fog hanging in the air. I hurried up the cracked concrete walkway to the front porch. As I reached the top step, my stomach dropped. The heavy wooden front door was splintered and hanging crookedly off its hinges. The deadbolt had been violently smashed inward. Someone had beaten me here. I pushed the broken door open and stepped into the entryway. The living room, usually kept perfectly tidy by my grandfather, was completely ransacked. Books were thrown off the shelves. The cushions on his floral sofa had been sliced open, white stuffing scattered across the faded rug. Drawers from his wooden desk lay overturned on the hardwood floor, papers everywhere. My heart hammered against my ribs. I held my breath, listening carefully. The house was entirely silent for a long moment. Then a distinct sound broke the quiet. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were moving across the floorboards upstairs right above my head. Someone was still inside the house, tearing through my grandfather's bedroom. I gripped the heavy brass fireplace poker from the living room hearth, my knuckles turning white. The heavy footsteps upstairs pounded directly above the ceiling, vibrating through the dust motes dancing in the gray light. I crept up the wooden staircase, holding my breath. Theodore had lived a modest life, but whoever was up there was tearing through his personal sanctuary like a starving animal. I reached the master bedroom and kicked the half-open door wide. There, standing over my grandfather's overturned mahogany dresser, was DeAndre Madison's husband. He had traded his usual tailored suits for a black designer tracksuit, but the heavy gold chain around his neck gave him away instantly. He was a striking African-American man who commanded attention in any room. But today, his polished entrepreneur persona was gone. He was supposed to be in the Caribbean clinking champagne glasses with my sister and my parents on a rented yacht. Instead, he was greedily stuffing Theodore's vintage Rolex watches and a velvet box of antique silver coins into a high-end leather duffel bag. "Put that down!" I demanded, raising the brass poker defensively. DeAndre did not even flinch. He slowly zipped the duffel bag, flashing that bright, arrogant smile that always won over my father. He possessed an unearned confidence, the kind that allowed him to effortlessly separate gullible investors from their life savings. "Well, look who decided to show up." DeAndre chuckled, slinging the heavy bag over his broad shoulders. He walked toward me with infuriating ease. "You are trespassing, DeAndre. I am calling the police right now," I warned, reaching for my phone with my free hand. DeAndre threw his head back and laughed loudly. "Call them, number cruncher. Tell them your brother-in-law is retrieving family heirlooms. Your dad already signed the estate over to Madison and me this morning before their flight. This property is ours now. Go balance a spreadsheet while real entrepreneurs handle the assets. Grandpa Theodore just went into the ground 2 hours ago." I fired back, my voice shaking with raw rage. "You skipped his funeral to loot his bedroom like a common thief." DeAndre stepped right up to me, using his height to tower over my frame. "Theodore was a broke old man who hoarded junk. But these watches will fetch a very nice price on the secondary market. Consider it back pay for all the times your parents had to cover his medical bills. Now step aside, Sydney." "You are not taking his things," I stated, planting my feet and standing my ground. DeAndre shoved me hard against the wooden door frame. The brass poker clattered loudly to the floor as my shoulder slammed into the wood. "Stay in your lane, Sydney," he sneered, looking down at me with absolute contempt. "You are just a bitter desk jockey making a pathetic hourly wage. Madison and I are building a massive crypto empire. We know how to move capital and leverage assets. You just stare at other people's money all day. This house, this land, it all goes to us." He stepped over the fallen poker and marched rapidly down the stairs. I scrambled to my feet, my shoulder throbbing intensely, and chased after him, but I was too late. The front door slammed shut, shaking the house. By the time I reached the front porch, DeAndre was already throwing the heavy duffel bag into the passenger seat of a sleek, white rented Maserati. He revved the engine, the exhaust roaring through the quiet Boston neighborhood, and sped off down the rain-slicked street. I stood on the porch, my blood boiling with a potent mix of anger and disgust. I dragged a heavy oak chair against the splintered front door, locking it as best as I could. The house fell dead quiet once again. DeAndre thought he had won. He thought he had grabbed the only things of value in this entire house. But DeAndre was a flashy amateur, a man who only saw the surface value of shiny objects. He did not know Theodore the way I did. My grandfather was a man of immense calculation and hidden depths. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and opened the scheduled text message I had received at the cemetery. Go to my house right now. They do not know about the loose floorboard under the washing machine. I bypassed the ransacked living room and headed straight for the cramped, dusty laundry room at the back of the house. The air smelled strongly of damp earth and old detergent. A bulky, decades-old washing machine sat stubbornly in the corner, looking entirely undisturbed. I rolled up the sleeves of my dark coat, wedged my hands against the rusted metal side, and pushed with all my physical strength. The heavy machine groaned against the linoleum flooring, scraping loudly as I forced it aside, inch by painful inch. Sweat beaded on my forehead by the time I moved the appliance far enough to reveal the floor beneath. The wood here looked identical to the rest of the room, warped and severely water-damaged. But as I ran my fingers along the seams, I felt a slight give. One of the short wooden planks was completely unattached. I pried the board up with my fingernails, tossing it aside. Nestled securely at the hollow space between the floor joists was a sleek, matte black steel box. It was a high-tech biometric safe, the kind of heavy-duty security equipment you would expect to find in a corporate bank vault, not beneath the floorboards of a supposedly impoverished pensioner. A small scanner on the top glowed with a faint, steady red light. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Theodore had prepared for this exact moment. He knew my parents and DeAndre would tear his house apart looking for quick cash, completely missing the real prize. I knelt on the dusty floor and pressed my right thumb firmly against the glowing glass scanner. The light turned instantly from red to solid green. A soft mechanical click echoed loudly in the small room. The heavy steel lid popped open smoothly on hydraulic hinges. I pulled the safe into the light. Inside, resting perfectly on a bed of dark foam, were 3 items. The first was a heavy industrial-grade black USB drive. The second was a metallic cold wallet, the specific hardware used to store massive amounts of untraceable cryptocurrency. And beneath them lay a thick, neatly folded legal document. I picked up the document with shaking hands. As a forensic accountant, I spent my entire life analyzing contracts, bank statements, and tax returns. I knew exactly how to read the hidden stories written in fine print. I unfolded the thick pages, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon at the top. My breath caught sharply in my throat. This was not just a simple will or a standard property deed. It was a comprehensive, highly confidential credit report and a massive loan origination file. And the signatures on the bottom line were going to blow my entire family's fake empire into absolute dust. I flattened the thick pages against the top of the washing machine, my eyes darting across the columns of numbers. As a forensic accountant, I tracked missing money for a living. It usually took weeks of subpoenas and court orders to piece together a paper trail this damning. But Theodore had done the hard work for me. The first page was a comprehensive credit report in my grandfather's name. His flawless credit score, maintained meticulously for over 50 years, had completely tanked. Attached to the report were 3 loan origination files totaling $150,000. The contact email listed on the applications belonged to my father Richard. The funds had been wired directly into an offshore account registered to Nova Coin Holdings, DeAndre's supposedly thriving crypto company. I traced the signature on the bottom of the loan agreement. It was a pathetic attempt to copy Theodore's shaky handwriting, but I recognized the aggressive loops and sharp angles immediately. It was my father's handwriting. They had stolen an old man's identity to finance a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. My phone shattered the silence of the damp laundry room, vibrating violently against the metal appliance. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Patricia. I answered the call, gripping the forged loan documents in my other hand. "Sydney, where are you?" Patricia demanded. There was no greeting, no sorrow over the fact that she had just missed her own father's burial. "I am standing in Grandpa Theodore's house," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. Or what is left of it, after DeAndre broke in and ransacked the place. "Do not be hysterical," Patricia snapped. "DeAndre is simply securing assets that rightfully belong to him and your sister. I need you to bring the spare house keys to our estate immediately. They need to begin the demolition assessment tomorrow morning." "Demolition assessment?" I asked, my grip tightening on the papers. "Theodore just went into the ground 2 hours ago, and you are already planning to bulldoze his home." "The property is worth more as an empty lot," Patricia said dismissively. "Stop wasting time. Bring the keys now. We have important family matters to settle." "Just like you settled my college fund," I shot back, unable to hold in the decades of resentment. "I am sure Madison and DeAndre need another handout to keep up appearances. Is that why you drained my tuition savings when I was 19? So Madison could have ice sculptures and a designer gown at her wedding, while I worked double shifts at a diner to pay for my textbooks." Patricia sighed, a sharp, condescending sound. "We made a strategic investment in this family's future. DeAndre is an innovator. He is building generational wealth. You chose to be a glorified calculator. Do not blame us for your lack of ambition." I looked down at the fraudulent loan files, my blood turning to ice. "An innovator," I repeated. "Is that what you call a man who needs his mother-in-law to commit elder abuse and federal identity theft just to keep his fake coin business afloat?" The line went dead silent. For a long, satisfying second, my mother had absolutely nothing to say. I could hear her sharp intake of breath over the speaker. "I have no idea what you are talking about," Patricia finally said, her voice dropping an octave, losing its haughty confidence and replacing it with pure venom. "You bring those keys to our house right now, Sydney, or I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing on DeAndre's property." She hung up. I stared at the darkened screen. They actually believed they had won. They thought they had covered their tracks, buried the evidence along with the man they had stolen from, and silenced the only daughter who saw right through them. I carefully folded the loan documents, the biometric safe's USB drive, and the heavy metal cold wallet, slipping them securely into the hidden compartment of my leather messenger bag. I walked out of the damp laundry room, stepped over the wreckage of my grandfather's living room, and walked out the front door. I pulled it shut behind me, not bothering to fix the broken lock. There was nothing left inside for them to steal. The drive to my parents' house took 40 minutes, leading me away from Theodore's modest working-class neighborhood and deep into the wealthiest gated community in the county. The towering wrought iron gate swung open as the security guard waved me through, recognizing my practical sedan from my infrequent obligatory holiday visits. I pulled up the long, sweeping driveway of my parents' sprawling brick mansion. The manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges looked obscene compared to the muddy, unkempt grave I had stood beside earlier that morning. I parked my car directly between my father's massive luxury SUV and DeAndre's rented white Maserati. I grabbed my messenger bag, feeling the solid weight of the evidence against my side. I marched up the wide brick steps and pushed open the heavy double doors without knocking. The smell of expensive catering and strong perfume hit me instantly. I walked down the marble hallway and stepped into the sunken formal living room. My family was gathered around a massive mahogany coffee table, looking like a promotional photo for a wealth management brochure. Richard and Patricia sat on a pristine white leather sofa, holding crystal glasses of sparkling water. Madison was perched on the armrest next to DeAndre, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. DeAndre had changed out of his tracksuit and was now wearing a sharp navy blazer, looking entirely unbothered by the fact that he had just committed breaking and entering. But they were not alone. Sitting in a high-backed armchair across from them was a man I did not recognize. He wore a bespoke gray suit, a gold watch that cost more than my car, and a predatory smug smile. He was a high-priced estate lawyer, The kind of man you hire when you want to make illegal things look perfectly legitimate on paper. As I entered the room, the conversation stopped. Richard set his glass down on a coaster. Madison smirked and whispered something into DeAndre's ear. Right on time, Richard said, his voice echoing in the large room. He did not ask how the funeral went. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply gestured to the empty chair across from the lawyer. Resting squarely in the center of the mahogany table was a freshly printed legal document. A gold fountain pen lay perfectly parallel to the signature line at the bottom. "Sit down," Sidney Richard commanded, folding his hands together. "It is time to finalize your grandfather's estate." Richard tapped his manicured fingers against the polished mahogany table, pushing the crisp stack of papers toward me. The smug lawyer sitting beside him adjusted his silk tie, refusing to meet my eyes. "Sign the quitclaim deed, Sidney." My father ordered, his tone leaving no room for discussion. He spoke to me the same way he spoke to the valets at his country club, with absolute impatient authority. Theodore left the house to Madison. "It is time to formalize the transfer so we can move forward with the demolition." I stared at the document, then looked up at Madison. She was lounging on a velvet accent chair, sipping a mimosa, as if we were discussing weekend brunch plans instead of erasing our grandfather's legacy. DeAndre stood behind her, a protective hand on her shoulder, flashing that same arrogant grin he had worn while looting Theodore's bedroom just hours earlier. "I am not signing anything," I stated flatly, keeping my hands firmly at my sides. "Grandpa Theodore would never leave his property to Madison. He knew exactly what you two would do to it." Patricia slammed her crystal glass down on the table, the sharp clink echoing through the cavernous living room. She stood up, her designer dress swishing as she pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "This is exactly why you are 33 years old and completely alone." "Sidney," my mother snapped, her voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You are so bitter. You spend your entire life hunched over a desk auditing other people's receipts for a living, and you cannot stand to see your sister actually succeeding. Madison and DeAndre are building a real empire. They have vision. All you have is a spreadsheet and a bad attitude." I did not flinch. This was the same predictable script Patricia had been reading from since I was a teenager. Madison was the visionary. Madison was the star. I was the boring, practical disappointment who insisted on paying her own rent instead of begging for allowances. "If their empire is so successful," I replied, my voice dangerously calm, "why do they need an 80-year-old man's rundown property so desperately?" "Because it is a prime lot for commercial zoning," DeAndre chimed in, stepping forward. "It is just business, Sidney. Do not make this emotional. The old man is gone. Madison is the rightful heir. Your dad is the executor. Just sign the deed and go back to your cubicle." I finally reached out and picked up the document. The lawyer stiffened slightly as I held the pages up to the natural light streaming through the massive bay windows. They thought I was just being stubborn. They completely forgot what I did for a living. I am a forensic accountant. I spend 60 hours a week hunting down corporate fraud, identifying forged ledgers, and exposing white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the system. It took me exactly 3 seconds to see the truth. I ran my thumb over the notary stamp pressed onto the final page. I looked at the lawyer, my eyes narrowing. "You notarized this in Suffolk County yesterday," I said, keeping my gaze locked on him. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his posture. "That is correct. I am a licensed notary in the state of Massachusetts. The document is fully binding." "That is fascinating," I replied, stepping closer to the mahogany table. "Because my grandfather was on a ventilator in the intensive care unit in Essex County yesterday. He could not speak, let alone hold a pen to sign a legally binding transfer of assets." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. "He authorized the transfer before he went into the hospital, Sidney. The notary just finalized the paperwork yesterday. Stop playing detective and sign the damn paper." I shook my head, flipping to the signature page. I traced the black ink with my index finger. "You guys really should have hired a better graphic designer for this little heist. Look at the kerning on the lettering here. The spacing between the letters in Theodore's signature is completely uniform. Human handwriting varies in pressure and spacing. This is a digital stamp. You lifted his signature from an old document, probably an old tax return, scaled it up, and printed it directly onto the quitclaim deed. The lawyer's smug expression vanished entirely. He glanced nervously at Richard, suddenly realizing his six-figure retainer might not cover the disbarment hearing he was currently risking. Madison stood up, her bottom lip trembling as she immediately deployed her favorite weapon. She started to cry. "Dad, make her stop," she whined, clutching DeAndre's arm. "She is trying to steal my inheritance. She has always hated me. Why is she doing this?" "Nobody is stealing anything from you, Maddie," Richard said, his voice softening instantly as he turned to comfort his golden child. He snapped his attention back to me, his jaw tight. "You listen to me, Sydney. I am the patriarch of this family. I decide how assets are distributed. You will sign this deed right now, or I will make sure you are cut out of every family trust, every holiday, and every future inheritance. You will be dead to us." I looked at the people standing in front of me, my mother glaring at me with pure disdain, my father demanding blind obedience, my sister hiding behind fake tears, my brother-in-law waiting to cash in on a stolen legacy. I lifted the forged quitclaim deed and let it slip from my fingers. The pages scattered across the polished mahogany table, breaking the perfect wealthy illusion of their living room. "You cannot cut me out of a family that never wanted me in the first place," I said quietly. "But you can absolutely expect a subpoena. I will see all of you in probate court." I turned on my heel, my heart pounding against my ribs, and walked toward the grand entryway. I needed to get to my car. I needed to get to the encrypted laptop in my trunk and plug in the black USB drive I had pulled from Theodore's safe. I had the real documents, the cold wallet, and the proof that could tear their entire world apart. I reached for the brass handle of the heavy double doors, ready to walk out of their lives for good. A heavy hand slammed against the wood right above my head, pushing the door firmly shut. I stepped back, startled. DeAndre had moved silently across the foyer. He stood blocking the exit, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. The charming entrepreneur mask had completely slipped away, leaving only a cold, threatening glare. "You are not going to probate court, Sydney," DeAndre said, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "Lawyers cost money. Court filings cost money. Auditing my businesses will cost a small fortune. Move out of my way, DeAndre," I demanded, gripping the strap of my messenger bag tightly. He did not budge. He just tilted his head, a sickening smirk spreading across his face. "You want to play hardball with the big boys? Go ahead. But before you go running to a judge, you might want to check your bank account, sweetheart." I pulled my phone from my dark coat pocket, my thumb hovering over the banking app icon before pressing the screen. Face ID unlocked the device and my stomach plummeted instantly. Instead of displaying my modest but hard-earned savings, a glaring red banner spanned the top of the interface. "Account frozen. Please contact your branch administrator." I tapped frantically into my checking account. Frozen. I checked my emergency fund. Frozen. Even the small conservative investment portfolio I had been quietly building for the last 5 years was locked down with a zero available balance. A low, rumbling laugh echoed from the formal living room. Richard walked slowly into the grand foyer, holding his crystal glass of sparkling water, looking immensely pleased with himself. "Did you really think I would let a 33-year-old desk clerk dictate the financial future of this family?" Richard asked, taking a slow, deliberate sip. "I sit on the executive board of that country club bank, Sydney. I play golf with the regional director every Sunday morning. All it took was one brief phone call to flag your accounts for suspicious forensic activity. Your assets are locked tight pending a full internal investigation. An investigation that I can ensure drags out for 6 to 8 agonizing months." I stared at the screen, the reality of his maneuver washing over me. He was starving me out. Without immediate access to my funds, I could not retain a probate lawyer. I could not file an injunction to stop the demolition of Theodore's house. I could not even pay my rent next week. Richard and Patricia wanted me entirely destitute, completely powerless to stop them from destroying my grandfather's legacy and laundering the stolen loan money through DeAndre's fraudulent company. I did not cry. My family thrived on emotional breakdowns. They wanted me to scream, to beg, to throw a hysterical tantrum so they could justify labeling me as the unstable, bitter spinster they always claimed I was. Forensic accountants do not cry. We calculate. I looked DeAndre dead in the eyes, my expression hardening into absolute stone. "Move," I commanded. DeAndre chuckled a deep, arrogant sound, but he stepped aside just enough for me to squeeze past his broad shoulders. I pushed the heavy oak front doors open and marched down the brick steps toward my practical sedan. I threw my messenger bag onto the passenger seat, climbed behind the wheel, and threw the car into drive. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached as I sped out of the gated community. I bypassed my apartment entirely. I did not need my personal bank accounts to do what came next. I just needed my corporate terminal. The downtown financial district was quiet and gray on a Saturday afternoon. I swiped my secure access badge at the glass turnstiles of my firm and took the express elevator to the 14th floor. The auditing bullpen was deserted, bathed in the low hum of cooling servers and the faint glow of standby monitors. I sat at my desk, booted up my heavily encrypted workstation, and logged directly into the secure federal databases my firm used for deep-dive corporate investigations. DeAndre thought he was an untouchable mastermind because he knew how to move digital currency. But cryptocurrency is only lauded as untraceable by flashy amateurs. To a trained forensic auditor, the blockchain is a brilliantly illuminated map. It leaves a permanent, immutable ledger of every single transaction. I pulled up the offshore account routing numbers from the forged loan documents I had rescued from Theodore's safe. I ran a reverse IP trace on NovaCoin Holdings. DeAndre had set up a chaotic maze of shell companies routing the stolen $150,000 through 3 different decentralized exchanges before dropping it into his primary corporate account. It was a sloppy, arrogant attempt at money laundering, built by a man who assumed nobody would ever look closely enough at the fine print. I pivoted my search, focusing my crosshairs on the smug lawyer sitting in my parents' living room and the notary stamp pressed onto the fake quitclaim deed, Arthur Vance. I pulled his public filing records, cross-referencing his corporate tax identification number against DeAndre's vast web of shell companies. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing command prompts and executing complex search queries. Within 20 minutes, I isolated a series of recurring, highly suspicious wire transfers. Arthur Vance had a consulting LLC registered to a generic P.O. box in Delaware. For the past 6 months, DeAndre's NovaCoin Holdings had been funneling bi-weekly payments of $5,000 directly into Vance's consulting account. It was a direct, undeniable payroll connection. DeAndre had a corrupt licensed notary on his permanent payroll, utilizing him to execute fraudulent documents, steal vulnerable properties, and secure illegal loans. I had the digital fingerprints. I had the exact timestamps of the offshore wire transfers. I had the definitive proof that my grandfather's signature was a paid forgery orchestrated by my own brother-in-law. I hit the print command. The heavy-duty laser printer at the far end of the hallway whined to life, churning out the 30-page dossier that was going to send DeAndre and Arthur Vance directly to federal prison and expose my father as a complicit accessory. As I stood up to retrieve the damning documents, my desk phone buzzed sharply, the sound cutting through the silent office like a siren. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Mr. Sterling, the senior managing partner of the firm. No one was supposed to be in the office today, let alone the head of the company. I picked up the heavy receiver. Sydney, Mr. Sterling said, his voice unusually strained and uncharacteristically cold. "Come to the main conference room immediately." I slowly lowered the receiver back onto the cradle. Through the soundproof glass walls of my office, I looked straight across the empty bullpen toward the main executive conference room. Sitting at the long mahogany table, clutching a crumpled tissue and crying perfectly calibrated crocodile tears, was Madison. I pushed open the heavy glass door of the executive conference room. The ambient noise of the building's HVAC system vanished, replaced by the sound of my sister's exaggerated, jagged sobbing. Mr. Sterling sat at the head of the long table, his hands folded neatly over a pristine legal pad. He was a man who lived for decimal points, regulatory compliance, and absolute order. He despised unpredictability, and Madison was currently treating his boardroom like a daytime talk show stage. Sydney, thank God, Madison gasped, pressing a damp tissue against her cheek. She did not even have the decency to smudge her mascara. I was just telling your boss how worried we are about you. You need serious help, sweetie. I walked slowly toward the table, the freshly printed 30-page dossier burning a warm, heavy hole against my side. I did not sit down. What exactly seems to be the problem, Madison? Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, his expression tight. Sydney, your sister, has brought some deeply concerning allegations to my attention. She claims that you are experiencing severe mental instability following your grandfather's passing. She has also presented accusations of financial misconduct. Misconduct is putting it lightly. Madison interrupted, her voice rising an octave to maximize the dramatic effect. She leaned forward, appealing directly to Mr. Sterling. My sister has a severe gambling addiction. She has been secretly siphoning money from our late grandfather's estate for months to cover her massive offshore losses. Today, she completely snapped. She broke into his house, stole confidential family documents, and threatened our father. She is an absolute liability to your firm. You cannot employ an embezzler who commits ethical violations on this scale. She needs to be fired immediately and referred to the authorities. I stared at her, genuinely impressed by the sheer audacity of her performance. Madison had always been an expert at projecting her own household sins onto whoever was standing closest. It was a survival tactic she had perfected growing up under Patricia's roof, where whoever cried loudest controlled the narrative. She was using terms like ethical violations and embezzlement, buzzwords she had undoubtedly memorized while sitting through DeAndre's previous legal depositions. Mr. Sterling looked at me, waiting for a defense. In the corporate auditing world, allegations of theft were a career death sentence. A normal person would have panicked, raised their voice, or desperately pleaded their innocence. I simply lifted the thick stack of papers and dropped it squarely onto the center of the conference table. The heavy thud echoed sharply, cutting off Madison's manufactured whimpers. I am not the one with a gambling problem, Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. I slid the dossier across the polished wood until it rested directly in front of him. My sister is projecting. Her husband, DeAndre, is currently operating a fraudulent cryptocurrency exchange called NovaCoin Holdings. The documents I supposedly stole are forged loan applications where they used our deceased grandfather's stolen identity to wire $150,000 to an offshore account. Madison's mouth fell open, her fake tears drying up instantly. You are lying. You are a psychotic, bitter spinster making up crazy stories because you cannot stand that I have a real life. Mr. Sterling ignored her entirely. He flipped open the dossier, his seasoned eyes instantly locking onto the highlighted transaction logs, the reverse IP traces, and the payroll ledger connecting the corrupt notary to DeAndre's shell companies. He read the numbers with the speed of a man who had spent 30 years hunting white-collar criminals. If you turn to page 14, I continued addressing my boss while maintaining peripheral eye contact with my sister. You will find the federal filings proving that my sister and her husband are currently under active investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission for wire fraud. You will also see the bankruptcy filings for their last 3 LLCs. They are broke desperate and attempting to liquidate an 80-year-old man's property to cover their tracks. That is fake. All of it. Madison shrieked, her carefully cultivated, affluent housewife persona cracking wide open. She slammed her hands down on the table, glaring at Mr. Sterling. She printed that out to frame us. Are you actually going to believe a low-level desk clerk over me? Mr. Sterling slowly closed the folder. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Madison with absolute chilling professional disgust. Sydney is a senior forensic auditor at one of the most prestigious financial firms in New England. Mr. Sterling said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. These are official bank routing protocols and certified SEC tracking numbers. It is highly illegal to bring falsified character assassinations into my office in an attempt to leverage a termination. He stood up, towering over the conference table. I am going to ask you to leave these premises immediately. If you are not in the elevator in exactly 2 minutes, I will have building security physically escort you to the street, and I will personally forward this entire dossier to the regional FBI field office before my lunch break." Madison stared at him, her chest heaving as she realized she had walked into a trap of her own making. She had thought she could manipulate a senior financial partner with fake tears and empty accusations, completely underestimating the fortress of undeniable data I had just built around myself. "Grab your bag, Madison," I said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the glass door. "We are done here." She snatched her designer purse off the leather chair. Her face flushed dark crimson with humiliated rage. She marched out of the conference room, her heels striking the floorboards like hammer blows. I followed closely behind her, ensuring she walked straight through the bullpen and out into the main elevator bay. I pressed the down button. The metal doors slid open immediately with a soft chime. "Step inside," I ordered. Madison stepped into the empty elevator car, spinning around to face me. The terrified, tearful victim routine was entirely gone. She looked at me with the same cold, calculating venom our mother possessed. "You think you are so smart, Sydney?" she spat, gripping the strap of her purse. "You think some printed papers are going to stop us? You think you won?" "I have the evidence," I replied, staring her down as the automated voice announced the doors were closing. "DeAndre is going to prison, and you will be lucky if you do not join him." Madison leaned forward just as the metal doors began to slide shut, a vicious, triumphant smile stretching across her face. "Wait until you see what Dad is doing to your apartment right now." The doors slammed shut, cutting off her laughter. Madison's venomous words echoed through the sterile elevator bay as the polished steel doors sealed shut. The ambient hum of the corporate office faded into the background, instantly replaced by the roar of adrenaline rushing through my ears. I did not waste a single second attempting to call my father. There was no point in negotiating with a man who operated exclusively on leverage and intimidation. I turned on my heel, sprinted past the reception desk, and burst out through the heavy glass doors of the financial firm. The Boston sky had turned a bruised charcoal, opening up to unleash a freezing, relentless downpour. I ignored the rain soaking through my professional blouse, dodging pedestrians, as I sprinted the 3 blocks to my parked sedan. My mind was a blur of frantic calculations. Richard was a ruthless tactician, but he was also predictably arrogant. If Madison knew about an attack on my apartment, it meant the wheels had been in motion long before Theodore's funeral even began. The tires of my sedan squealed against the slick asphalt as I sped toward my neighborhood. The drive normally took 20 minutes, but I made it in 12, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I turned onto my familiar, tree-lined residential street, praying Madison had just been bluffing. She was not. My stomach tied itself into a rigid, painful knot as I pulled up to the curb. There, heaped carelessly on the wet, cracked sidewalk, was my entire life. Dozens of cheap, thin black garbage bags sat rapidly filling with rain. Several of the bags had already split open against the concrete. I could see the sleeve of my favorite winter coat trailing in a muddy puddle. My kitchen plates, my framed credentials, and the antique lamp I had restored by hand were carelessly shoved into a cardboard box that was currently disintegrating in the downpour. I slammed the car into park and ran up the concrete steps to the modest brownstone apartment I had rented for the last 4 years. I pulled my keys from my pocket, my hands trembling with raw, unfiltered fury. I jammed my apartment key into the lock of the heavy oak door. It did not turn. The brass cylinder was brand new, gleaming mockingly under the dim porch light. "You are using the wrong key, Sydney!" A deep voice boomed from the shadows. My father stepped out from the covered portion of the wraparound porch, perfectly shielded from the rain. He was wearing a tailored cashmere overcoat, looking entirely at ease. Beside him stood a man I had never seen before. He wore an ill-fitting polyester suit reeked of cheap cologne and was chewing loudly on a piece of gum while clutching a weathered clipboard. "What is this?" I demanded, pointing at the heap of ruined bags on the sidewalk. "You cannot legally evict a tenant without 30 days of written notice. This is a criminal offense." The man in the cheap suit chuckled, a grating, sleazy sound. He tapped his pen against the clipboard. I am afraid standard tenant protections do not apply when a resident is found in violation of emergency morality clauses, miss. Richard waved a dismissive hand, silencing the property manager. Let me handle this, Vince, my father said, stepping closer to the porch railing to look down at me. You have always possessed a very limited view of how the world works, Sydney. You think because you pay your rent on time you are secure, but you do not own anything. You rent. You exist at the mercy of the people who actually hold the capital. He leaned against the wooden pillar, a triumphant, calculated smile spreading across his face. I purchased this brownstone a month ago, Richard stated, his voice dripping with condescension. I used a holding firm, of course. Zenith Properties, LLC, a simple, untraceable shell company. I knew the moment Theodore's health started failing that you would try to interfere with the estate. You always were an irritatingly stubborn child. I needed an insurance policy. My forensic accounting brain kicked into overdrive, immediately analyzing the sheer scale of his manipulation. He had deliberately bought the building I lived in, hiding behind a corporate veil, just to have a weapon to use against me when Theodore finally passed away. He had anticipated my resistance to his fraud and laid a trap weeks in advance. I am your landlord now, Richard sneered, looking down at the ruined garbage bags on the wet pavement. And you are evicted for violating the moral turpitude clause in your lease agreement. Moral turpitude, I repeated, wiping the freezing rain from my eyes. You cannot invent a lease violation out of thin air. I do not have to invent anything, Richard replied smoothly. Your sister just informed me that you were officially accused of embezzlement and severe ethical violations at your accounting firm today. A landlord has every legal right to immediately terminate the residency of a tenant engaging in active corporate fraud. Vince here has already filed the emergency eviction paperwork with the city. He had taken Madison's fabricated tantrum from the conference room and instantly weaponized it into a legal loophole. It was a masterclass in financial sabotage. He had frozen my bank accounts to starve me of legal funds, and now he was putting me out on the street to break my spirit entirely. Richard pulled a folded document from his cashmere coat pocket. It was the same forged quitclaim deed from his living room. He held it out toward me, the rain completely avoiding the crisp white paper. You have no money, no home, and a looming SEC investigation hanging over your head, Richard said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register. Sign over Grandpa's house, and I will give you your keys back. I will unfreeze your bank accounts. I will even call your boss and clear up this unfortunate embezzlement misunderstanding. He expected me to break. He expected the freezing rain, the ruined belongings, and the overwhelming weight of his billionaire tactics to finally crush the defiance out of me. He expected me to reach out, take the pen, and surrender Theodore's legacy just to get my warm bed back. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I did not beg. I turned my back on my father. I walked down the concrete steps, stepping squarely into a puddle, and grabbed the first soaking wet garbage bag. I hauled it over my shoulder, marched to my sedan, and threw it into the trunk. I walked back, grabbed a cardboard box of soggy books, and shoved it into the back seat. What are you doing? Richard demanded, his smug confidence faltering for the first time. The illusion of his absolute control was fracturing. Sydney, stop being a stubborn fool. You cannot survive on the streets. You have nothing. I grabbed the last surviving bag of my clothes and slammed the trunk shut. The metallic crash echoed down the quiet neighborhood street. I wiped the rain from my face and reached into my leather messenger bag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and closed around the heavy industrial-grade black USB drive I had extracted from Theodore's hidden floorboard safe. I turned to face my father standing in the pouring rain. I held the metal USB drive up, letting the dim porch light catch its matte black surface. You used a shell company called Zenith Properties to buy this building, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the sound of the storm. A holding firm that is undoubtedly linked to the same offshore banking network DeAndre uses to launder his fake crypto assets. You thought you were boxing me in, Richard. You thought you were hiding your assets. I gripped the drive tighter. But I have Theodore's master ledger. I continued, taking a slow step forward. I have the entire digital map of your fraudulent loans, your stolen identities, and every single shell company you and DeAndre have registered in the last 5 years. By purchasing this building to intimidate me, you just legally tied your own name to the same racketeering network that is going to land your son-in-law in federal prison. Richard's face drained of all color. The arrogant sneer vanished, replaced by stark absolute panic. He gripped the porch railing, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. I lowered the USB drive and slid it safely back into my bag. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. I left Richard standing frozen on the wet pavement, the relentless Boston rain soaking through his expensive cashmere. I did not wait for his shock to morph back into rage. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and sped away, the tires kicking up a massive spray of muddy water onto his polished leather shoes. I knew exactly how men like my father and DeAndre operated. They controlled resources, which meant they controlled people. My frozen bank accounts were just the beginning of their siege. They would inevitably monitor my credit cards, trace my phone, and leverage every corporate contact they possessed to track my movements. I needed to disappear off their grid entirely. I drove straight to the industrial outskirts of the city, pulling into the cracked, weed-choked parking lot of a dilapidated cash-only motel. The neon vacancy sign buzzed with a harsh, flickering red glow, casting long shadows across the empty lot. I walked into the stale lobby, handed the clerk an untraceable $50 bill I kept in my glove compartment for emergencies, and took the physical brass key to room number 9. The room smelled of stale smoke and heavy industrial bleach. I locked the flimsy door through the deadbolt and jammed a heavy wooden chair firmly under the handle. I pulled the heavy curtains tightly shut, blocking out the intermittent glare of passing headlights. I did not care about the peeling wallpaper or the deeply stained carpet. I only cared about the small, wobbly desk in the corner and the single working electrical outlet right next to it. I unzipped my damp messenger bag and pulled out my heavily encrypted corporate laptop, plugging the power cord directly into the wall. I booted up the system, deliberately bypassing the standard firm network and logging straight into my local administrative environment. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the heavy matte black USB drive. Theodore had hidden this drive inside his floorboard safe for a reason. He knew DeAndre was bleeding his finances dry, and he had clearly been gathering his own evidence before the stroke silenced him. I inserted the drive into the USB port. Instantly, a stark security prompt materialized on the screen demanding a 24-character alphanumeric password. DeAndre had locked it down with military-grade encryption software. It was a formidable, highly expensive barrier designed to deter amateur snoops and local law enforcement. But I was not an amateur. I was a senior forensic auditor who hunted digital ghosts for a living. I opened a command terminal and initiated a proprietary brute force decryption tool I had developed specifically for dismantling offshore shell company firewalls. The screen immediately cascaded with lines of rapid glowing green code as my algorithm began systematically attacking the encryption matrix, testing thousands of cryptographic permutations per second. The laptop's internal cooling fans whined, kicking into overdrive as the processor pushed itself to the absolute limit. A loading bar appeared at the center of the screen. 5%. 15%. I paced the small room, my heart hammering relentlessly against my ribs. 35%. The files contained inside this drive were the key to everything. They held the original untampered ledgers, the true quitclaim deeds, and the definitive proof of DeAndre's racketeering network. 60%. The loading bar crept agonizingly upward. 85%. 92%. I stood directly over the desk, my eyes glued to the illuminating screen. 98%. A loud, violent electrical pop echoed from the transformer outside. Instantly, the entire motel went pitch black. The humming ventilation unit died. The glowing red neon sign outside the window vanished. The only light remaining in the room was the harsh, pale glow of my laptop screen running on reserve battery power. Before I could even process the sudden outage, a deafening crash shattered the silence. The wooden chair I had wedged under the door handle snapped in half. The deadbolt tore straight through the cheap wooden frame with a violent splintering crash. DeAndre stood in the doorway, his massive silhouette framed by the ambient streetlights outside. Rain dripped heavily from his dark leather coat. In his right hand, he held a solid steel crowbar. "Did you really think you could hide from me, Sydney?" DeAndre sneered, stepping into the room and kicking the broken door shut behind him. His voice was laced with a terrifying, breathless adrenaline. "You drive a modern sedan with a built-in GPS tracking module. I bought the subscription package under Zenith Properties when Richard and I transferred the title to my name. I watched your little dot drive straight to this dump." I took a slow, calculated step backward, putting the small desk between us. "You cut the power to the building. I am not playing games anymore," DeAndre growled, raising the heavy crowbar slightly. The charming, polished entrepreneur facade was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, violent man cornered by his own monumental greed. "You are going to hand over the drive right now. The old man owed me that money. He promised to invest in my vision, and then he tried to back out. I just took what was rightfully mine. Give it to me." I did not scream. I did not cower against the wall. I reached slowly, deliberately into my wet coat pocket. "You are going to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary, DeAndre." He lunged forward, swinging the crowbar viciously toward the desk. I ripped my hand out of my pocket and discharged a direct, concentrated stream of police-grade pepper spray straight into his eyes. DeAndre shrieked, dropping the crowbar as his hands flew to his burning face. He stumbled blindly, crashing into the desk and knocking the cheap motel lamp to the floor. Through his agonizing curses, he blindly grabbed the thick strap of my leather laptop bag sitting on the edge of the mattress. In the distance, the sharp, unmistakable wail of approaching police sirens pierced the night air. The motel manager had clearly called the authorities the second the door was smashed in. DeAndre panicked. Clutching the bulky laptop bag tightly against his chest, he scrambled back through the shattered doorway, stumbling blindly into the pouring rain and fleeing into the darkness. The sirens grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights beginning to bounce off the wet brick walls of the alleyway outside. I stood alone in the center of the dark, wrecked motel room. I did not chase him. I did not panic about the stolen bag. I simply took a deep breath, let the adrenaline settle, and smiled. I slowly uncurled my left hand, opening my palm in the dark. Resting safely against my skin, completely untouched by my violent brother-in-law, was the real matte black USB drive. I did not stay in room number 9 to see if DeAndre would realize his mistake and come back. I slipped out the back exit, keeping to the deep shadows of the rain-slicked alleyway until I reached my sedan. I threw the car into drive and merged onto the interstate, putting miles of dark highway between myself and my family's escalating insanity. DeAndre had my encrypted work laptop, but without the physical decryption key and my biometric clearance, it was nothing but an expensive paperweight. I had the real prize burning a hole in my pocket. I drove 3 towns over, pulling into the sprawling, brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour big box retailer. The store was virtually empty at this hour, bathed in harsh fluorescent light and the hum of industrial refrigerators. I walked down the sterile electronics aisle, grabbed the cheapest, thickest plastic laptop they had on the shelf, and paid at the self-checkout register using the last of my emergency cash reserves. I needed a clean machine, something entirely disconnected from my firm's network, my personal Wi-Fi, and any digital footprint Richard could potentially monitor. I parked at a desolate highway diner a mile down the road. The neon sign buzzed erratically outside the rain-streaked window. I ordered a black coffee, slid into a sticky vinyl booth in the far corner, and ripped the cheap laptop out of its cardboard packaging. The battery indicator showed a 50% charge. It was enough. I booted up the machine, skipped past the relentless setup prompts, and plugged the matte black USB drive into the side port. The security prompt immediately flashed on the screen, demanding the 24-character alphanumeric password. DeAndre thought his military-grade encryption was impenetrable. But my brute force algorithm had reached 98% completion right before the motel power grid blew. The localized cache on the drive had stored the final cryptographic bypass sequence. My fingers flew across the stiff plastic keyboard, inputting the bypassed key. The firewall dropped instantly. The main directory opened, displaying dozens of meticulously organized folders. Theodore had labeled everything with the precise, uncompromising exactness of an old-school auditor. There were no vague titles, only dates, corporate identification numbers, and asset classifications. I clicked into the master financial ledger. The spreadsheets bloomed across the cheap screen, revealing columns of routing data, offshore accounts, and property deeds that made my breath catch in my throat. I blinked, rubbing my tired eyes, assuming the formatting was a mistake. I ran a quick summation formula on the primary column. The numbers did not change. Theodore was not living on a meager pension. My entire family had treated him like a senile, irrelevant old man barely clinging to a rundown warehouse property. Patricia and Richard constantly mocked his modest lifestyle, rolling their eyes at his outdated truck and his refusal to wear designer suits. They had no idea they were mocking a ghost. Theodore was the sole proprietor and silent owner of a massive real estate holding corporation called Ironclad Estates. The liquid assets and property valuations listed in his personal ledger totaled in the hundreds of millions. He owned luxury residential high-rises in downtown Boston. He owned massive commercial shipping ports along the eastern seaboard. He possessed a diversified portfolio that dwarfed Richard's entire net worth by a factor of 10. As I cross-referenced the zoning deeds, a sharp, disbelieving laugh escaped my lips. Theodore owned the sprawling 200-acre plot of prime real estate directly beneath Richard's precious country club. My father paid exorbitant, humiliatingly high yearly dues to play golf on land his own father silently owned and leased to the city. Theodore had spent decades watching his son parade around like a self-made titan, knowing all the while he held the deed to Richard's entire social playground. I took a long drink of the bitter diner coffee and kept digging, driven by a pure forensic adrenaline. I opened a subfolder titled Strictly Richard and Patricia. Inside was a high-resolution scan of an original promissory note stamped notarized and legally binding. I zoomed in on the property address listed in the header. It was my parents' $5 million estate in Fairfield. The sprawling, perfectly manicured colonial they paraded in front of their high society friends. The house Richard constantly used as undeniable proof of his self-made empire and unmatched business acumen. It was a complete fiction. A desperate, hollow lie. Richard and Patricia did not own a single brick of that estate. Theodore had purchased the property entirely in cash through an anonymous blind trust 12 years ago. He had been leasing the mansion back to my parents under a private seller-financed mortgage agreement. They were nothing but glorified tenants living in Theodore's spectacular dollhouse. I scrolled down to the amortization schedule in the attached payment ledger. My parents were absolutely drowning. They had been missing their monthly payments for exactly 60 months. 5 years of massive compounding arrears. My parents were completely broke, living a desperate, leveraged lie, funded entirely by my grandfather's quiet, unacknowledged generosity. This was exactly why Richard was so desperate to bulldoze Theodore's warehouse and sell the land. He needed the commercial zoning payout to cover his massive debts before his fake empire collapsed. I scrolled down to the final page of the blind trust agreement. Theodore was a brilliant man. He had anticipated their bottomless greed. He knew exactly what Richard and Madison would do the moment his health failed, and he had set a legal trap from the grave. At the bottom of the contract, jumping off the screen in stark highlighted red text, was a specific legal contingency. Theodore's attorney had labeled it the poison pill. I read the clause twice, the words burning themselves into my memory. The legal language was bulletproof, leaving absolutely no room for interpretation or probate loopholes. In the event that the lessees Richard and Patricia attempt to manipulate, coerce, or financially defraud any legitimate heir to the broader estate, this lease agreement is rendered immediately null and void. The entire $5 million principal, along with all compounded arrears and accrued legal penalties, becomes due in full within 24 hours. Failure to remit payment will result in immediate asset seizure and criminal prosecution. I sat back against the vinyl booth, staring at the glowing screen as the rain lashed against the diner window. Richard had frozen my bank accounts, ordered my eviction, and thrown my belongings onto the wet pavement to prove he owned my life. He had no idea I was currently holding the detonator to his. The heavy bass of a rented sound system reverberated through the quiet, historic neighborhood, rattling the leaves of the ancient oak trees. Madison and DeAndre had wasted absolutely no time. It was Saturday afternoon, exactly 1 week since my father changed the locks on my apartment, and they were already hosting a lavish demolition party on Theodore's front lawn. I parked my car down the street and walked slowly toward the property, taking in the sheer grotesque spectacle of their arrogance. They had transformed my grandfather's peaceful yard into a corporate carnival. Massive white marquees stretched across the grass. Waiters in crisp black vests circulated with silver trays of champagne and roasted hors d'oeuvres. A massive glossy banner hung across the front porch, displaying a digital rendering of a brutalist glass monolith with the words Novacoin Headquarters printed in bold silver lettering. DeAndre was holding court near a towering ice sculpture surrounded by a group of sleek, wealthy investors. He was wearing a tailored linen suit, gesturing grandly toward the historic Victorian house as he pitched his decentralized finance vision. He was selling them on the future, utilizing property he had stolen to solicit millions in new investments. Every word leaving his mouth was adding another year to his impending federal sentence. They thought I was entirely broken. They thought I was sleeping in the back seat of my sedan, shivering in a cheap motel parking lot, completely neutralized by their financial siege. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 7 days sitting in a quiet, sunlit diner, methodically untangling Theodore's hidden empire, preparing the ultimate legal trap, and finalizing my masterclass in destruction. I stepped through the wrought iron gates. I was not wearing my usual practical auditing slacks or a sensible cardigan. I wore a razor-sharp tailored emerald green power suit that fit like physical armor paired with immaculate stiletto heels. I walked with the precise measured cadence of an apex predator stepping into a cage full of oblivious mice. Patricia saw me first. She was standing near the catered buffet holding a crystal flute of champagne, laughing loudly with 3 women from her elite country club circle. I could hear her bragging about Richard's newest golf handicap, completely oblivious to the fact that her dead father-in-law literally owned the ground beneath that very golf course. Her laughter died the instant her eyes locked onto me. The color drained from her face, quickly replaced by a mask of pure, ugly rage. She slammed her champagne glass onto a nearby table, the crystal clinking sharply. "Security!" Patricia shrieked, her shrill voice slicing through the thumping house music. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. "Get over here immediately. Throw this homeless trash out of here right now." I did not flinch. I did not stop my relentless forward momentum. The sheer blinding irony of Patricia calling me homeless when I held the legal documentation proving she was 5 years delinquent on a secret lease for her own mansion was almost too sweet to bear. 2 hired security guards, broad-shouldered men wearing black polos and earpieces, stepped squarely into my path, raising their hands to block me. I did not break my stride. I looked the larger guard dead in the eyes, my expression utterly devoid of fear. "I am the primary legally appointed executor of this estate," I stated with absolute freezing authority. "Touch me and you will be facing federal kidnapping and trespassing charges before the hour is up." The guard hesitated, his hands faltering. In the corporate world, confidence is a weapon, and I was wielding it with lethal precision. They stepped aside, parting like a curtain. I glided past my mother, ignoring her outraged, sputtering gasps. I walked straight up the wooden steps onto Theodore's beloved wraparound porch. The DJ, a young man wearing oversized headphones, was bobbing his head behind a massive mixing board. He looked up, startled by my sudden appearance. "Hey, lady, you cannot be up here," he protested, reaching out to block his equipment. I did not say a word. I simply reached down, gripped the main audio cable plugged into the center of his mixer, and yanked it straight out of the socket. The thumping, chest-rattling bass died instantly. A sharp, ringing silence swept across the sprawling lawn. Over 100 wealthy investors, socialites, and local politicians stopped talking mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison, confused faces looking up toward the porch. I picked up the heavy silver microphone from the table. I tapped the steel mesh top with my index finger. A sharp, piercing screech of audio feedback echoed across the grass, guaranteeing that every single pair of eyes was locked entirely on me. Down on the lawn, DeAndre stood completely paralyzed next to his glossy architectural blueprint. His jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle visibly ticked in his cheek. Madison clutched his arm. Her face drained of all color, her Oscar-worthy confidence shattering in real time. Richard violently pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his fists balled at his sides, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he prepared to order me dragged away by force. But they were too late. I already held the microphone. I already commanded the audience. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the immaculate lawn. "I apologize for interrupting the music. But since we are celebrating real estate and family legacy today, let us talk about DeAndre's actual portfolio." I gripped the heavy silver microphone, letting the sharp, piercing echo of audio feedback fade into the stunned silence of the manicured lawn. Below me, a sea of bewildered faces stared up toward the porch. These were Boston's elite. Venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and eager tech investors, all currently holding crystal champagne flutes paid for with my grandfather's stolen legacy. DeAndre stood absolutely paralyzed, next to his glossy architectural blueprint, his perfect linen suit suddenly looking like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy surgical precision of a senior auditor delivering a final terminal report. "You were all invited here today to celebrate the groundbreaking of NovaCoin headquarters." I began, my voice booming across the historic brick facade of the house. "You were told this prime piece of real estate was the foundation of a decentralized financial revolution. You were sold a vision of exponential growth by a self-made visionary." I reached into the inner pocket of my emerald green blazer and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of neatly stapled documents. I had spent the last 48 hours compiling, verifying, and aggressively highlighting the exact offshore money trails. I walked to the edge of the wooden porch, looking directly at a silver-haired man in the front row, whom I recognized as the managing director of a major local equity firm. I tossed the first packet down to him. It landed squarely at the toe of his Italian leather shoes. I threw another packet to a woman in a Chanel suit standing right next to him. "Those are official SEC filings cross-referenced with international banking ledgers and property deeds," I stated, making sure every single syllable rang out clearly over the hushed crowd. "DeAndre does not own this house. He does not own the land beneath it. He is completely, irrevocably broke." A collective nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. The silver-haired investor bent down, picked up the packet, and began rapidly scanning the highlighted numbers. I did not stop. I maintained my relentless, unyielding presentation. "The NovaCoin token you have been aggressively pitched this afternoon is a mathematically documented Ponzi scheme." I continued, staring directly into the crowd of wealthy targets. "The liquidity pool does not exist. The millions in seed capital you were promised do not exist. The funds have been systematically funneled into shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands to pay off his massive compounding personal debts. If you wire him money on Monday morning, you are not buying into the future of cryptocurrency. You are buying a one-way ticket into an active federal investigation. The FBI is currently auditing those exact offshore accounts. The moment you invest your capital will be immediately frozen as evidence of wire fraud." The carefully constructed illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces. DeAndre's arrogant, polished composure dissolved into raw, animalistic panic. The wealthy investors he had spent months meticulously grooming were now looking at him not with admiration or excitement, but with absolute terrified disgust. "Shut up!" DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking wildly as the reality of his total ruin set in. "Turn that off. She is lying. She is a disgruntled, psychotic ex-employee." He lunged forward, scrambling up the wooden porch steps like a desperate, cornered animal. His eyes were wide and frantic. He reached out with both hands, aiming to tackle me to the floorboards and rip the microphone from my grip. He was blindingly fast, fueled by the terrifying realization that his entire fabricated life was imploding right in front of his primary funding source. But he was entirely careless. He completely forgot about the thick, heavy audio cable I had yanked from the mixing board just minutes earlier. The thick black cord lay coiled in a messy loop across the wooden floorboards directly in his warpath. DeAndre's expensive leather shoe caught the heavy cable. His forward momentum viciously betrayed him. He pitched forward, his arms flailing uselessly in the air as he lost all sense of balance. He crashed face first onto the hard wooden planks of the porch with a sickening, heavy thud. The sheer impact knocked the wind straight out of his lungs, leaving him groaning, gasping for air, and clutching his bruised ribs right at my feet. I did not flinch. I simply stepped neatly out of the way, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the wood. Down on the lawn, absolute unfiltered chaos erupted. The silver-haired equity manager aggressively pulled out his cell phone, shouting into the receiver to freeze all pending wire transfers to Zenith Properties immediately. The woman in the Chanel suit threw her half-empty champagne glass onto the grass in disgust and marched straight toward the wrought iron gates. The entire crowd followed suit. It was a stampede of tailored suits and expensive silk dresses. Dozens of investors were speed-dialing their wealth managers, their voices overlapping in a panicked, furious symphony of demands for refunds and threats of immediate legal action. The hired catering staff watched in bewildered silence as the lavish demolition party completely dissolved into a frantic, angry evacuation. DeAndre's entire fake empire had burned to ash in less than 3 minutes. Madison was kneeling on the grass near the ice sculpture, sobbing hysterically, as the elite socialites she had so desperately courted shoved past her without a single backward glance. Then a heavy, brutal force clamped down on my left arm. Richard had stormed up the porch stairs while I was watching the crowd disperse. His fingers dug into my bicep with a bruising, desperate strength. His face was contorted with a rage so profound it bordered on sheer madness. The veins in his neck bulged angrily against his starched white collar. His carefully cultivated image as the untouchable, refined patriarch was completely shredded. He was not a titan of industry anymore. He was a panicked, leveraged old man watching his fraudulent house of cards collapse into the dirt. "You have destroyed this family's reputation." Richard hissed, his voice a low, venomous growl, barely audible over the panicked shouts of the fleeing investors. "I will see you in jail on Monday for corporate espionage and theft." I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, feeling the sharp, burning pain of his fingers digging into my skin. I entirely refused to acknowledge it. I looked back up into my father's furious, desperate eyes. I did not shake. I did not break eye contact. I forcefully, violently yanked my arm out of his grip, taking a deliberate step back. I smoothed the pristine fabric of my emerald blazer with absolute icy calm. "See you in probate court." It was early Sunday morning, less than 24 hours after the total implosion of DeAndre's lavish demolition party. The Boston skyline was shrouded in a thick slate-gray fog, reflecting the cold, brutal reality of the war I was currently waging. I sat in the freezing, glass-paneled conference room of Vance & Associates, the most feared and ruthless probate litigation firm on the eastern seaboard. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, keeping the massive room at a sterile, calculated temperature, designed to keep clients awake and intimidated. Evelyn Vance did not take Sunday morning meetings. She also did not take new clients without a minimum 6-figure retainer paid up front. I had effortlessly bypassed both of those strict corporate barriers by transferring exactly $150,000 in completely untraceable Bitcoin directly into her firm's escrow account at 3 in the morning. The funds had not come from my frozen bank accounts. They had come from a digital cold wallet Theodore had kept securely taped to the underside of his heavy oak desk drawer in the warehouse. Richard, in his absolute arrogant ignorance of modern decentralized finance, had completely overlooked it during his aggressive sweep of the property. My father operated in a world of country clubs, paper checks, and old money prestige. He thought the small metal device was just a useless broken thumb drive. He had absolutely no idea his own father had been quietly moving massive amounts of liquid assets off the grid for the last 3 years, methodically anticipating the exact legal siege we were currently fighting. Evelyn Vance sat directly across from me, her posture impeccably straight, her sharp, calculating eyes studying me over the rim of her coffee cup. She was a legal predator wearing a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. She did not deal in emotion or familial sentiment. She dealt in facts leverage and absolute destruction of opposing counsel. That was exactly why I hired her. She dropped a thick, heavy manila folder onto the center of the pristine glass table. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the quiet room. Inside that folder was a high-resolution copy of the forged last will and testament Richard had aggressively filed with the city court on Friday afternoon. It was the same document he had shoved in my face on the wet pavement outside my apartment. "Your father is exceptionally thorough, Sydney," Evelyn stated, her voice devoid of any comforting warmth. She opened the folder and slid the crisp white pages toward me. "I have spent the last 4 hours reviewing this filing with my senior paralegals. It is a masterpiece of legal fiction. The formatting is flawless. The signature matches your grandfather's historical handwriting with terrifying precision. The dates are perfectly aligned with Theodore's initial hospital admission, creating a highly believable narrative that he updated his estate planning in a moment of sudden medical panic." I looked down at the forged signature, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Richard had not just hastily scribbled Theodore's name on a piece of paper. He had financed an entire fabricated legal ecosystem. He bought the entire system. I said, my voice steady, despite the raw anger burning in my chest. Evelyn nodded, tapping a manicured finger against the official embossed seal at the bottom of the final page. He did not just forge a document. He bought the necessary validation. He bribed a licensed veteran notary public who has a spotless 30-year record in this city. He secured 2 independent witnesses from his elite country club circle who are completely willing to perjure themselves under oath in a federal courtroom. They have officially sworn they stood in that hospital room and watched Theodore sign this exact document of his own free will. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the cold glass, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "They have the judge fooled, Sydney," Evelyn warned, her tone dropping into a grave, serious register. "The probate court operates heavily on the presumption of validity when a document is properly notarized and witnessed by reputable citizens. The legal burden of proof is entirely on us to prove fraud. On paper, this document looks completely undeniably legitimate. If we walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning without absolute, irrefutable proof of malice, the judge will rubber stamp this forgery without a second thought. He will immediately hand the entire estate to Madison." I knew exactly what a loss in probate court meant. It meant total annihilation. If the judge validated that document, Madison would instantly liquidate the warehouse property. DeAndre would use the massive cash injection to cover up his fraudulent offshore loans and escape federal prison. Richard would finally gain legal control of the 200 acres of prime real estate sitting directly beneath his precious country club, burying Theodore's true legacy forever. And I would be left completely destitute, facing fabricated corporate espionage charges orchestrated by my own father. They expected me to panic. They expected the crushing weight of the legal system to finally force me into submission. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of fear. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made even Evelyn Vance narrow her eyes in surprise. I reached down into my leather messenger bag and pulled out the cheap, thick plastic laptop I had purchased at the big box store. I set it deliberately on top of Richard's meticulously forged paper documents. I flipped the screen open, the harsh glare illuminating the dark conference room. "I am a forensic auditor, Evelyn," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute unshakable authority. "I do not rely on paper. Paper can be easily manipulated. Signatures can be perfectly traced by high-end graphic designers. Desperate notaries and wealthy country club friends can be bought with a few $1,000s in an unmarked envelope." I turned the plastic laptop around, sliding it across the glass table so the screen directly faced the high-powered attorney. "I rely on metadata." I continued, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I rely on the invisible, indestructible digital fingerprints that arrogant, outdated men like my father and my brother-in-law constantly forget to erase. They think because a document is printed and stamped, its history is secure. But every single keystroke, every saved draft, every hidden financial transaction leaves a permanent radioactive trail in the server logs. I hit the enter key, executing the final decryption sequence I had finalized in the diner. Let me show you what I extracted from DeAndre's servers. Monday morning arrived with a biting chill that cut straight through the Boston fog. The Suffolk County Probate Court was an imposing fortress of gray stone and heavy mahogany doors. It was a place designed to intimidate, to grind down the weak, with the slow, crushing weight of the legal system. But as I walked down the echoing marble corridor alongside Evelyn Vance, I felt absolutely no fear. I felt nothing but cold, calculated anticipation. The double doors to courtroom 3B swung open. Richard, Patricia Madison, and DeAndre made their grand entrance. They did not walk, they strutted. They moved with the arrogant, unearned confidence of people who believed they had successfully purchased reality. Richard wore a bespoke navy pinstripe suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, projecting the image of a grieving but resolute patriarch. Patricia was dripping in tasteful, understated diamonds, her face set in an expression of rehearsed sorrow. Madison wore a modest, high-necked black dress, playing the role of the devoted, heartbroken granddaughter to absolute perfection. DeAndre was trailing slightly behind them, his face pale, and a visible bruise forming on his jawline from his spectacular fall on Saturday. But he still wore a custom Italian suit, desperately clinging to his shattered facade. They took their seats at the plaintiff's table. Richard glanced over his shoulder at me. A smug, victorious smirk played at the corner of his mouth. He truly believed he had won. He believed Saturday's humiliation was just a temporary nuisance, a minor temper tantrum from a defeated woman. He believed the forged piece of paper in his lawyer's briefcase was his impenetrable shield. Their attorney, a slick, overpaid partner named Sterling, stepped up to the podium. He carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my first year of college tuition. He unclasped it with a sharp snap, extracting a crisp, pristine white document, and handed it directly to Judge Harrison, a stern, tired-looking man sitting high on the bench. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced authority. "We are here today to execute the final, undeniable wishes of Theodore Wilson. I present to the court his last will and testament, drafted and signed in his final days. As you can clearly see, it explicitly revokes all prior documents. It names my client, Richard Wilson, as the sole executor and leaves the entirety of the estate, including the historic warehouse property, to his beloved granddaughter, Madison." Judge Harrison adjusted his reading glasses, scrutinizing the pages. "I see a signature here, and it appears properly notarized." "Yes, Your Honor," Sterling replied smoothly. "Notarized by a licensed public official with a 30-year spotless record. Furthermore, we have two independent, upstanding members of the community sitting right here in the gallery who personally witnessed Theodore sign this document of his own free will." The judge looked over the document, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the plaintiff's table. "Is there any context the family wishes to provide regarding this late-stage change in the estate planning?" Patricia did not miss a single beat. She stood up, clutching a lace handkerchief in her trembling hands. The performance she delivered was worthy of an Academy Award. "Your Honor," Patricia said, her voice shaking with manufactured emotion. "Theodore was a wonderful man, but his final months were terribly lonely. My daughter Madison was the only one who truly cared for him. She spent every single afternoon sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand, reading to him when he was too weak to open his eyes. She was his absolute light in the dark." Patricia squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a single perfect tear to roll down her powdered cheek. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction. "Sydney abandoned him years ago." Patricia choked out, letting a sob break her voice. She moved away. She obsessed over her corporate accounting career. She never called. She never visited. She left that poor old man to die alone. It broke Theodore's heart. He realized in his final days that blood does not always mean loyalty. He wanted to reward the one person who actually loved him. He wanted Madison to have the house. He explicitly told us he did not want Sydney touching a single dime of his legacy. "We just want to honor his final wishes. We just want to protect his memory from someone who only showed up when there was money to be claimed." The sheer blinding audacity of her lie echoed off the courtroom walls. I sat perfectly still. Evelyn Vance sat next to me, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly on the glass table. She did not object. She did not interrupt. She let Patricia hang herself with every single fabricated word. I looked at my mother. I thought about the reality she was so desperately trying to overwrite. I was the one who drove 3 hours every Sunday to sit on the porch with Theodore. I was the one who managed his medical appointments, who brought him his favorite black coffee from the diner down the street, who listened to his endless stories about the Boston real estate market in the 70s. Madison had not visited Theodore in 5 years. The last time she saw him, she complained that his house smelled like old books and demanded he buy her a new car. But I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. I let the silence stretch out heavy and thick. Judge Harrison sighed, taking off his glasses. He looked down at the document again, tapping his pen against the heavy wooden bench. The court relies heavily on the presumption of validity. When a document is properly notarized and independently witnessed, the judge stated, his voice echoing with finality. The paperwork presented by the plaintiff is on its face flawless. The legal requirements have been entirely met. Richard leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Madison subtly wiped away her fake tears, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across her lips. DeAndre let out a long, audible breath of relief, visibly relaxing his tense shoulders. They thought it was over. They thought the gavel was about to fall, cementing their theft into permanent legal reality. Judge Harrison turned his gaze directly toward our table. He looked at Evelyn, then he looked at me. His expression stern and unforgiving. Ms. Wilson, the judge said, his voice dropping into a warning register. Your opposition has presented a legally binding certified document. Unless you can provide concrete, irrefutable evidence of fraud, I have absolutely no choice. Do you have any evidence to contest this document, or should I rule in favor of the estate? The entire courtroom held its breath. The silence was deafening. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany table and pushed myself up. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at my father or my mother or my sister. I locked my eyes directly onto the pale, bruised face of my brother-in-law. I have a few questions for DeAndre first. Judge Harrison's heavy gavel struck the sound block with a sharp, echoing crack that silenced the murmuring courtroom. He leveled a stern, unwavering gaze at our table, clearly annoyed by the interruption, but bound by judicial procedure to allow the cross-examination. He gestured toward the witness stand. DeAndre stood up from the plaintiff's table, smoothing the lapels of his custom Italian suit. He did not look like a man stepping into a legal crossfire. He looked like a man walking onto a red carpet. He flashed a brilliant, rehearsed smile toward the gallery, offered a reassuring nod to his wife Madison, and confidently strode up the wooden steps to the witness box. He placed his left hand flat on the Bible, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the whole truth. He settled into the leather chair, leaning back with a posture of absolute unbothered arrogance. He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with condescending pity. He truly believed he was untouchable. Evelyn Vance stood up from the defense table. She did not rush. She buttoned the center button of her charcoal blazer, picked up a single manila folder, and walked toward the center of the courtroom with the slow, methodical pacing of an apex predator. Mr. DeAndre, Evelyn began, her voice crisp, loud, and echoing clearly off the high mahogany ceilings. You have submitted a sworn affidavit to this court regarding the execution of Theodore Wilson's final will and testament. I would like to clarify the exact timeline of those events. DeAndre adjusted his silk tie, leaning casually into the microphone. Of course. I am happy to clear up any confusion my sister-in-law might be experiencing. Evelyn did not react to the jab. She pulled a copy of the forged will from her folder and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to DeAndre. Please look at page 4, section 7, Evelyn instructed. Is that your signature listed as the primary independent witness? It is, DeAndre answered smoothly, not even needing to look at the paper. And the date recorded directly next to your signature? April 12th. DeAndre stated, his voice ringing with practiced sincerity. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember it vividly. Evelyn began to slowly pace in front of the jury box, her eyes fixed on him. You remember it vividly. Excellent. Please describe that afternoon for the court. DeAndre shifted his weight, adopting an expression of deep, manufactured sorrow. He looked toward the judge, playing the role of the grieving family member with nauseating perfection. Theodore was fading fast. DeAndre began, his voice dropping an octave to convey emotional weight. He called me and Richard into his hospital room. He was incredibly weak, but his mind was sharp. He told us he had made a terrible mistake by trusting Sydney. He said she had abandoned him, that she only cared about her corporate career, and he wanted to make things right for Madison. He pulled this document from his bedside drawer. He held the pen in his own trembling hand. I watched him sign it right there in the hospital bed at exactly 3:15 p.m. on April 12th. I signed immediately after him as a witness. From the plaintiff's table, Patricia dabbed at her eyes with a lace tissue. Madison let out a soft staged sniffle. It was a perfectly choreographed family performance designed to emotionally manipulate the entire courtroom. Evelyn stopped pacing. She stood dead center in the room, her expression turning into a mask of pure freezing steel. You watched him hold the pen? Yes. You watched him physically sign the document? I did. And you swear under penalty of federal perjury that this event took place in person on April 12th at 3:15 p.m. DeAndre smiled, a smug, arrogant flash of white teeth. I swear it, under oath. Evelyn Vance turned away from the witness stand and looked directly at me. I gave her a single sharp nod. Evelyn signaled the court clerk. A massive high-definition projector screen slowly descended from the ceiling behind the judge's bench. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. Evelyn plugged a small encrypted flash drive into the podium's terminal. Your Honor, Evelyn addressed the judge, her voice cracking through the tension like a whip. The plaintiff's counsel submitted this will to the probate court via the mandatory electronic filing system. They submitted a digital PDF scan of the supposedly physical document. My client, Sydney Wilson, is a senior forensic auditor specializing in corporate fraud. She does not rely on paper. Paper can be forged, signatures can be traced, notaries can be bribed. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard sat up straight, his face suddenly draining of color. Sterling, their high-priced lawyer, gripped his pen so hard his knuckles turned white. Evelyn tapped a key on the podium. A massive, complex string of computer code and digital properties flashed onto the screen in stark, glowing green text. She relies on metadata, Evelyn stated, pointing directly at the projected data. What you are looking at, Your Honor, is the permanent, indestructible digital footprint embedded within the exact PDF file the plaintiff submitted to this court. She tapped another key. A specific line of text enlarged on the screen, highlighted in bright, blinding yellow for the entire room to read. File Origin Zenith Properties Executive Office Terminal. Author DeAndre_admin date. Created April 15th. Time. Created 2:14:33 a.m. The entire courtroom went dead silent. The air was sucked completely out of the room. DeAndre stared up at the massive projection, his jaw dropping open, his arrogant smile vanishing instantly into a mask of pure, suffocating horror. Mr. DeAndre, Evelyn said, turning back to the witness box, her voice ringing with lethal, undeniable authority. Can you explain to this court why the digital metadata of this PDF shows that the original digital document was created on the IP address of your private office computer on April 15th at 2 in the morning, exactly 3 days after Theodore Wilson passed away? DeAndre physically recoiled in the wooden chair. His face turned a sickly ashen gray. Sweat beaded instantly on his forehead. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked desperately toward his lawyer, but Sterling was already frantically flipping through his legal pad, actively physically distancing himself from his own client. I repeat the question, Evelyn demanded, stepping closer to the witness box. How did a dead man sign a document that did not digitally exist until 72 hours after his heart stopped beating? I don't. DeAndre stammered, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand, his knuckles white, his eyes darting wildly around the room like a trapped animal. There must be a mistake, a virus. I don't know computers. He was caught in an active, undeniable federal perjury trap, and he knew it. The judge's face hardened into a mask of absolute furious judicial wrath. Before the judge could strike his gavel, Richard violently shoved his heavy oak chair back. It screeched horribly across the marble floor. He jumped to his feet. His face flushed a dangerous, explosive shade of purple, completely losing his mind as he watched his criminal empire evaporate in real time. "Objection!" Richard screamed, his voice raw and frantic, pointing a shaking, desperate finger at the projector screen. "This is a technical glitch. It means nothing. As Theodore's only son, I inherit the estate by default anyway." Judge Harrison did not hesitate. His heavy wooden gavel slammed against the sound block with the force of a gunshot cracking through Richard's hysterical outburst. "Sit down this instant, Mr. Wilson, or I will have the bailiff place you in handcuffs for contempt of court." Judge Harrison roared, his voice projecting absolute furious authority. "You do not dictate the laws of succession in my courtroom. You have just been implicated in a federal forgery conspiracy. Intestate succession only applies if there is no valid estate planning in place. And given the staggering level of fraud I have just witnessed regarding this document, I am formally requesting a federal inquiry into your entire family's financial activities." Richard collapsed into his heavy oak chair, as if the bones in his legs had suddenly evaporated. He gasped for air, his face a terrifying shade of crimson. Patricia grabbed his arm, her carefully powdered face completely drained of color. I stepped away from the defense table. I buttoned the front of my emerald suit, feeling the smooth, cool fabric beneath my fingertips. The panic radiating from my family was a physical heat in the room, but I remained utterly, perfectly cold. "Actually, Your Honor," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom. "My grandfather did not leave his estate to the default laws of succession. He knew exactly what his son would attempt to do the moment his heart stopped beating. Theodore left a video message for this exact scenario." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small encrypted silver USB drive. I handed it to Evelyn, who nodded once and passed it directly to the court clerk. "Your Honor, Defense Exhibit C," Evelyn stated cleanly. "A secure time-stamped video recording executed by Theodore Wilson on April 10th, 2 full days prior to his medical emergency. It was stored on an offline ledger entirely out of the reach of his son." Judge Harrison nodded sharply. "Play it." The massive digital monitors mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The overhead lights dimmed automatically. Every single pair of eyes in the gallery, the jury box, and the plaintiff's table locked onto the high-definition screens. Theodore Wilson appeared. He was not the weak, fading old man Richard and Patricia had just described in their manufactured narrative. He was sitting behind his massive oak desk in the warehouse wearing his favorite tweed vest. His back was remarkably straight. His eyes were sharp, lucid, and burning with the terrifying, unyielding intelligence that had built an empire from absolutely nothing. "Richard, Patricia." Theodore's voice boomed through the courtroom speakers, rich and gravelly. "If you are watching this, it means I am dead. It also means you have dragged Sydney into a courtroom, attempting to steal what you falsely believe is yours." A sharp collective gasp echoed through the public gallery. Madison clamped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with mounting terror. "You always were greedy parasites, Richard." Theodore continued, looking directly into the camera lens with absolute unfiltered disgust. "For 30 years I watched you leverage my name to build your fragile country club reputation. I watched you treat my warehouse like an embarrassment, while you secretly relied on my capital to bail out your failing investments. You raised your daughters to value status over substance. You taught Madison to measure a person by the price of their shoes, and you systematically, deliberately tried to crush Sydney because she was the only one in this family who actually worked for a living." On the video, Theodore leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on the wooden desk. "You thought I was just a senile old man playing with blueprints?" Theodore said, a dark, knowing smile spreading across his face. "You thought you could swoop in, forge some paperwork, and divide my life's work among your vapid social circle. But I have spent the last 5 years auditing my own legacy. I mapped every shell company DeAndre set up. I tracked every fraudulent loan you signed, Richard. I knew you would try to steal the estate the second I was gone, so I made it legally impossible. DeAndre buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as his total destruction was broadcast to the entire room. Wills go to probate court, Richard. Theodore explained, his tone mocking his son's absolute ignorance of high-level asset management. Wills can be contested by greedy relatives. I did not leave a will. 6 months ago, I quietly transferred my entire portfolio. The commercial properties, the residential leases, the offshore crypto accounts, and the 200 acres of land sitting directly beneath your precious golf course. Theodore paused, ensuring every single person in the room felt the full weight of his next words. I placed my entire $500 million empire into an irrevocable blind trust. The dollar amount hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. $500 million. The sheer magnitude of the hidden wealth was staggering. Patricia gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked like she might physically vomit. Richard stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream. An irrevocable trust cannot be altered, contested, or touched by probate law, Theodore stated, his voice ringing with absolute, crushing finality. It bypasses you completely. It cannot be broken. And the sole beneficiary, the sole trustee, and the absolute legal executor of that trust is the only person in this family who possesses an ounce of integrity. Sydney. Theodore leaned back in his chair, a look of profound peace settling over his weathered face. I leave you exactly what you earned, Richard. Nothing. Sydney, if you are watching this, tear their fraudulent empire to the ground. I love you, kid. The screen cut to black. The silence in the courtroom was so absolute it felt heavy enough to crush bone. Then Patricia snapped. The illusion of the refined, wealthy matriarch completely shattered into thousands of jagged pieces. She leaped to her feet, knocking her heavy wooden chair backward onto the marble floor with a violent crash. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, ugly primal rage. That is illegal! Patricia shrieked at the top of her lungs, her shrill voice echoing violently off the stone walls. She pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face, tears of furious panic streaming down her cheeks. You manipulated him. You brainwashed a dying old man. We are his family. We are his blood. You cannot do this to us. You cannot leave us with nothing. Judge Harrison picked up his gavel and brought it down with a thunderous, definitive strike that severed her screams. Order in my court, the judge bellowed, glaring down at Patricia with absolute judicial fury. You will control yourself, Mrs. Wilson, or you will spend the night in a holding cell. The video testimony is clear, lucid, and legally binding. The trust is ironclad. Sydney is the legal owner of everything. Case dismissed. The echo of Judge Harrison's heavy wooden gavel faded into the high mahogany ceilings, but the devastation it left behind was absolute. The meticulously crafted illusion of the Wilson family empire had been completely atomized in less than 5 minutes. Patricia slumped into her chair, her manicured hands covering her face as she let out a long, ragged wail of sheer disbelief. Madison sat frozen, staring blankly at the dark projection screen, as if hoping Theodore's face would magically reappear and take it all back. Richard remained standing. His chest heaved with heavy, labored breaths. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to pull him down to his inevitable destruction. He opened his mouth to argue, to command the room as he had done his entire life, but the unyielding reality of the $500 million irrevocable blind trust had stripped him of every ounce of his power. He was no longer the untouchable patriarch. He was just a leveraged, desperate man standing in the wreckage of his own greed. Judge Harrison gathered his files, preparing to stand and exit the bench. Please wait, Your Honor. I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the frantic murmurs of the courtroom. I am not entirely finished. The judge paused, raising a single weary eyebrow. He settled back into his leather chair, gesturing for me to proceed. Evelyn Vance stepped forward. She did not carry a thick stack of legal briefs this time. She carried a single weathered blue folder. It looked out of place among the pristine, glossy legal documents scattered across the plaintiff's table. She approached the bench and handed the folder directly to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. "Your Honor." I continued, my voice calm, projecting effortlessly across the room. "As the legally appointed sole executor of the Theodore Wilson estate, I am required to immediately execute all outstanding financial directives. Specifically, I am officially executing Section 4, Paragraph B of the trust." Richard's head snapped toward me. His eyes locked onto the blue folder in the judge's hands. The last remaining color drained from his face, leaving him chalk white. He recognized that folder. He knew exactly what it contained, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. "What is this?" Judge Harrison asked, opening the folder and scanning the heavy notarized parchment inside. "That is a promissory note, Your Honor," I answered, turning my body to face my father directly. I looked him dead in the eyes. I did not flinch. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. I let him feel the full crushing weight of his lifelong hypocrisy. "You built your entire identity on being a self-made titan of industry," I said, my words dropping like ice water into the silent room. "You paraded around the country club lecturing everyone about hard work and fiscal responsibility. You called me a failure. You called me an embarrassment. But you do not own your mansion, Richard. You never did. Grandpa owned it." Patricia gasped, her head snapping up. She looked frantically between her husband and me. "Richard, what is she talking about?" Patricia demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Tell her she is lying. Tell her we own our home." Richard did not look at his wife. He could not tear his terrified gaze away from me. His silence was a deafening confirmation. 15 years ago, when your commercial investments went completely bankrupt, Theodore bailed you out," I explained, making sure every person in the gallery heard the truth about the great Richard Wilson. "He purchased the deed to your sprawling suburban estate. He paid off your luxury cars. He funded the lifestyle you used to make me feel small. He allowed you to live there rent-free under one extremely specific condition." I gestured toward the document in the judge's hands. "Theodore embedded a poison pill clause into that promissory note," I stated, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. "The clause explicitly states that if you, Richard Wilson, ever attempt to contest his estate, or if you attempt to file fraudulent claims against his designated heirs, the total balance of the bailout becomes immediately due. You triggered the trap the second you walked into this courtroom today and handed the judge a forged will." I took a deliberate step closer to his table. "You owe the trust $5 million, in full, due at 5:00 p.m. today." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic whispers. Patricia clutched her diamond necklace, her breathing turning rapid and shallow as the reality of her impending poverty washed over her. She looked at her husband with an expression of pure, unfiltered horror, realizing the luxurious life she had fiercely guarded was nothing but a fragile loan. "Your Honor." Richard choked out, his voice cracking wildly. He scrambled toward the podium, gripping the wooden edges so tightly his hands shook. "This is extortion. This is a targeted, malicious attack by a disgruntled daughter. You cannot possibly enforce this. I need time. I need to liquidate assets. I need to contact my wealth managers." Judge Harrison looked over his reading glasses, his expression devoid of any mercy. He had just witnessed this man attempt to commit federal perjury and estate fraud. He was entirely out of patience. "There is no extortion here, Mr. Wilson," the judge stated, his voice booming across the room. "I am looking directly at your signature on this promissory note. The language is perfectly clear, and the poison pill mechanism is a standard legal deterrent in highly aggressive trusts. You chose to gamble your home by filing a forged document in my courtroom. You lost that gamble." The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. "The terms of the trust are immediately enforceable," Judge Harrison declared. "Pay the trust the $5 million by 5:00 p.m. today, or the property is officially foreclosed and you will be immediately evicted by the county sheriff." He slammed the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Richard staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he were having a physical heart attack. Patricia buried her face in her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Madison sat paralyzed, staring at her perfectly manicured hands entirely ruined. The untouchable, arrogant family that had tormented me for decades was completely decimated. While the gallery buzzed with the shock of the verdict, I noticed a subtle movement near the back of the courtroom. DeAndre was slowly, carefully inching his way away from the plaintiff's table. His custom Italian suit suddenly looked incredibly cheap. His face was slick with terrified sweat. He had watched his father-in-law lose a $5 million mansion in a matter of seconds. He knew the digital metadata proving his forgery was already in the hands of the court clerk, and the FBI was currently auditing his offshore Zenith Properties accounts. He reached out a trembling hand, desperately trying to push open the heavy mahogany doors and quietly slip out the back of the courtroom before the federal marshals waiting in the hallway caught wind of his exit. DeAndre's hand slipped wildly against the polished brass handle of the courtroom doors. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy mahogany wood, desperate to escape the suffocating air of Judge Harrison's courtroom. He was mere inches away from the hallway. He was inches away from calling a private car, fleeing to an airstrip, and leaving his manufactured disaster behind. He shoved the door open. A solid wall of dark gray fabric completely blocked his path. Two federal agents wearing crisp suits and stern, unyielding expressions stepped directly into the threshold. They did not look like the gullible venture capitalist DeAndre was so used to charming with his perfectly rehearsed pitches. They looked like the absolute end of the line. DeAndre Vance, the taller agent, stated. His voice was a low, heavy rumble that carried perfectly back into the stunned silence of the courtroom. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, offshore tax evasion, and the deliberate forgery of federal documents. DeAndre tried to stumble backward. He tried to raise his hands in a gesture of diplomatic surrender, opening his mouth to spin one final desperate lie. The agents did not give him a single second to speak. The taller agent grabbed DeAndre by the shoulder of his custom Italian linen suit, spinning him around with swift, brutal efficiency. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around DeAndre's wrists echoed loudly through the cavernous space. DeAndre's knees buckled. His polished, untouchable arrogance evaporated entirely. He looked back into the courtroom with wide, terrified eyes. He did not look like a tech visionary anymore. He looked exactly like a cornered thief. A piercing, ragged shriek shattered the frozen silence of the room. Madison scrambled out from behind the plaintiff's table. The modest, respectful black dress she had chosen for her role as the grieving granddaughter suddenly seemed entirely out of place as she sprinted clumsily down the center aisle. Her expensive heels clattered violently against the marble floor. She completely bypassed her father, who was still slumped in his heavy oak chair, paralyzed by the $5 million debt hanging directly over his head. Madison lunged at me. Her perfectly manicured hands clamped down hard on the sleeve of my emerald power suit. Her face was streaked with ruined mascara and sweat. The Oscar-worthy performance of the heartbroken family member was gone. She was nothing but a frantic, terrified woman watching her fraudulent, luxurious lifestyle disintegrate into ash. "Sydney, please!" Madison screamed, her voice shrill and frantic. "You have to stop this. You are the executor now. You have $500 million. You are rich now. Bail him out. Pay whatever they want. We are sisters." I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. I did not pull away immediately. I let the absolute suffocating silence of the room stretch out. I looked directly into Madison's tear-stained, desperate face. I did not see my sister. I saw the girl who stood by in silent, smug approval while Richard drained my college fund to buy her a brand new sports car. I saw the woman who laughed at me during Sunday dinners while our mother ruthlessly mocked my practical clothing and my quiet ambitions. I saw the arrogant socialite who fully supported changing the locks on my apartment, completely willing to leave me homeless and shivering on the street just to secure her husband's fake, crumbling empire. I reached down and calmly, deliberately peeled her fingers off my sleeve one by one. I smoothed the pristine fabric of my suit, maintaining absolute freezing eye contact with her. "You want bail money?" I asked. My voice dropped to a calm surgical register that carried effortlessly across the silent room. "Use DeAndre's crypto. Oh wait, it is entirely worthless." Madison's jaw dropped open. The breath left her lungs in a sharp, painful gasp. Her knees gave out completely. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor right in the center aisle. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing in loud, hysterical, uncontrollable heaves that echoed off the high ceiling. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply stepped neatly around her crumpled form. Evelyn Vance fell into step perfectly beside me. We walked down the aisle with synchronized precision, the clicking of our stiletto heels sounding like a steady, relentless drumbeat of victory. We walked past DeAndre, who was currently being read his Miranda rights and dragged out into the hallway by his collar. We walked past Judge Harrison, who was already calmly shuffling his papers to prepare for the next case. We pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the sprawling, sunlit lobby of the Suffolk County Courthouse. The air felt significantly lighter out here. The heavy scent of desperation and cheap cologne was finally gone. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound, undeniable sense of absolute control. The trap Theodore and I had set was triggered flawlessly. The execution was complete. But the Wilson family was not entirely finished humiliating themselves. Before Evelyn and I could reach the grand marble staircase leading to the exit, a frantic, chaotic scramble of footsteps echoed rapidly behind us. Patricia threw herself directly into our path. She had lost her diamond earrings somewhere in the courtroom panic. Her meticulously sprayed hair was sticking up in wild, frantic directions. The refined, untouchable country club matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a woman entirely broken by reality. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving aggressively as she blocked my path to the front doors. I stopped. Evelyn stopped beside me, crossing her arms and watching the pathetic spectacle with the detached analytical interest of an apex predator observing its defeated prey. Patricia did not try to negotiate. She did not try to use her usual patronizing maternal tone. She dropped straight to her knees on the dusty courthouse floor. She grabbed the hem of my suit jacket, looking up at me with a face entirely contorted by absolute unfiltered terror. People walking through the lobby stopped dead in their tracks. Lawyers, filing clerks, and security guards turned to stare in shock at the wealthy, manicured woman begging loudly on her hands and knees. "We are your parents!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking into a ragged, pathetic wail. "You cannot make us homeless." The dashboard clock in my car flipped from 5 o'clock to 5:01 p.m. I did not look back at Patricia sobbing on the courthouse floor. I simply stepped over her, walked out the double-glass doors, and got into my waiting car. The drive to the Wilson estate took exactly 40 minutes. By the time my driver pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the property, the sky had bruised into a deep, turbulent purple. Heavy thunder rolled across the manicured lawns. Right behind my vehicle were 3 black and white county sheriff cruisers, their lights flashing silently against the darkening sky. A beat-up rented box truck was parked haphazardly in the circular driveway. Its loading ramp was deployed, resting on the pristine cobblestones. The front doors of the mansion were thrown wide open. I stepped out of the car, adjusting the lapels of my suit. Sheriff Miller, a towering man with a stern, deeply lined face, fell into step beside me. 2 of his deputies flanked us as we walked up the sweeping marble steps and crossed the threshold into the grand foyer. The interior of the house was a scene of absolute frantic devastation. Patricia was frantically wrapping a heavy silver candelabra in a silk dining tablecloth, her hands shaking so violently she dropped it twice. Her neck was draped in 3 different diamond necklaces, layered clumsily over her silk blouse. She had stuffed several velvet jewelry boxes into an overflowing canvas tote bag. Richard was halfway down the grand staircase, struggling under the weight of an original 19th century oil painting he had ripped from the study wall. His tie was undone, his collar stained with sweat. He was panting heavily, his face flushed an unhealthy shade of crimson as he barked frantic orders at his wife to hurry up. They were looting their own home like common thieves fleeing a sinking ship. "Drop the painting, Richard," I commanded. My voice echoed sharply off the vaulted ceiling, cutting through the chaos. Richard froze. He looked down at me from the landing, his eyes wide with cornered panic. Patricia gasped, dropping the silver candelabra. It hit the marble floor with a heavy metallic clang that rang out like a funeral bell. "You have no right to be here!" Richard snarled, his chest heaving as he tightened his grip on the gilded frame of the painting. "We have until midnight. My lawyers are filing an injunction. You cannot do this." I glanced at my watch. The deadline was 5 o'clock p.m. You missed it by 22 minutes. And your lawyers dropped you as a client an hour ago when they realized the estate accounts were entirely frozen. You have absolutely nothing left to pay them with. I gestured to Sheriff Miller. The sheriff stepped forward, resting a hand squarely on his utility belt. "Mr. Wilson," Sheriff Miller stated, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "Place the artwork on the floor and step away. You have been formally served with an eviction notice. This property and all of its contents now legally belong to the Theodore Wilson Blind Trust. You are trespassing." "They are stealing my property!" Patricia shrieked, clutching the canvas tote bag to her chest. "These are my things. These are my family heirlooms." I walked slowly toward the center of the foyer, shaking my head. I looked at the layered diamond necklaces glittering frantically against Patricia's trembling neck. "Nothing in this house belongs to you, Patricia," I said cleanly. "Grandpa Theodore purchased that silver candelabra at an auction in London. He paid for those diamond necklaces to keep up your precious country club appearances. He bought that oil painting Richard is holding because he felt sorry for your complete lack of culture. Everything inside these walls was purchased with Grandpa's money." I turned to the sheriff, maintaining my calm, icy composure. "Sheriff," I continued, my voice unwavering, "as the executor, I am officially declaring that they are only allowed to take their basic clothing. The jewelry, the artwork, the silver, and the luxury vehicles in the garage belong to the estate. Strip them of everything else." The two deputies immediately moved forward. Patricia let out a horrified, guttural scream as a deputy firmly took the canvas tote bag from her hands. She slapped at him, weeping hysterically, as he ordered her to unfasten the diamond necklaces. Richard slowly lowered the oil painting to the stairs, his entire body shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and primal rage. He marched down the remaining steps, his fists clenched at his sides. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon the terrifying, authoritative presence he had wielded over me for my entire life. He stopped inches from my face, glaring down at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "You think you have won?" Richard hissed, spit flying from his lips. "You think taking this house makes you a success. You are a cold, heartless monster. We gave you a life. We raised you. If you do this, you are crossing a line that can never be uncrossed. You will have no family left. Nobody will ever love you. You will die completely alone." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who had spent 3 decades trying to break my spirit. "You made me an orphan 10 years ago, Richard," I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "The day I asked for help with my business and you laughed in my face. The day you told me I was a worthless investment while you bought Madison a second sports car. The day you explicitly told me I was no longer a member of this family unless I submitted to your control. You severed this family a long time ago. I am just making it official." Richard's jaw trembled. The last remaining shred of his inflated ego completely shattered. He had no threats left. He had no leverage. He was just a broke, evicted man standing in a house he never truly owned. "Get them out," I instructed the sheriff. "Now," Sheriff Miller nodded. He grabbed Richard firmly by the arm, spinning him toward the door. The deputies escorted a weeping, hyperventilating Patricia right behind him. They were marched forcefully out the front doors and down the marble steps. A massive crack of thunder shook the ground, and the sky finally ripped open. Freezing, heavy rain poured down in absolute sheets, instantly soaking Richard and Patricia to the bone. Their expensive silk and tailored linen clung to their shivering bodies as the deputies forced them off the manicured driveway and directed them toward the rusted, rented box truck. Patricia slipped on the wet cobblestones, scraping her knees as she scrambled into the passenger side of the truck. Richard climbed heavily into the driver's seat. He turned the key and the engine sputtered to life with a pathetic, wheezing cough. The windshield wipers squeaked violently across the glass as he shifted into gear. I stood under the protective canopy of the grand entrance, my emerald suit perfectly dry. I watched silently as the moving truck rattled down the long, winding driveway, heading out into the dark, punishing storm toward a cheap highway motel. The heavy wrought iron gates swung shut behind them, locking with a loud, definitive metallic crash. Exactly 30 days had passed since the heavy wrought iron gates of the estate locked my father out in the freezing rain. I stood in the center of what used to be Grandpa Theodore's original property. For decades, Richard had loudly and publicly mocked this place. He called it a dusty, outdated relic and embarrassment to the Wilson family name. He refused to set foot inside it, blinded by his obsession with sprawling suburban mansions and country club aesthetics. He never understood that Theodore kept this property precisely because it was solid, unassuming, and built on a foundation of absolute stone. It was the perfect place to build an empire. I had gutted the interior entirely. The decaying wood and outdated fixtures were completely stripped away. In their place stood the sleek, immaculate headquarters of my newly launched firm, Wilson Forensic Accounting and Fraud Investigation. The space was now a high-tech fortress of floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass, polished concrete, and matte black steel. Row upon row of advanced dual-monitor workstations lined the main floor. The faint, steady hum of encrypted servers resonated through the climate-controlled air. I had spent the last 4 weeks quietly and aggressively poaching the most ruthless, brilliant financial minds and legal analysts in the state. My team specialized in tracking hidden offshore assets, dismantling fraudulent shell companies, and hunting down the exact type of corporate parasites my father and brother-in-law had tried to be. I stood behind my massive custom-built quartz desk, looking out over the bustling floor of my analysts. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, my hair pulled back into a sharp, severe style. I was no longer the dismissed daughter. I was the absolute authority. The heavy glass door to my private office slid open. Evelyn Vance, whom I had officially hired as my chief operating officer, stepped inside. She carried a sleek silver tablet and a small stack of physical mail. The morning market reports are fully summarized on the secure drive, Sydney Evelyn stated, efficiently setting the tablet on my desk. The Zenith Properties offshore accounts have been successfully liquidated and transferred into the primary trust. And the federal prosecutor called. DeAndre's legal team is attempting to negotiate a plea deal. They are offering full cooperation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Let them offer whatever they want, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. DeAndre forged federal documents to steal an inheritance. The Department of Justice can handle him. He is no longer my concern. Evelyn nodded in agreement. She tapped the small stack of physical mail resting on the edge of the quartz desk. Everything else is standard corporate correspondence, Evelyn noted. However, this one bypassed the digital scanners. It was marked strictly personal. I looked down. Resting on top of the glossy corporate envelopes was a cheap, thin, slightly crumpled envelope. There was no return address. The postmark was from a zip code 50 miles outside the city limits, an area famous for dilapidated truck stops and hourly motels. The handwriting was erratic, smeared slightly by what looked like water or sweat. It lacked the bold, arrogant, sweeping flourish my father usually used when signing his name to fraudulent loans. I picked up the envelope. The paper felt rough and cheap against my fingertips. I slid a steel letter opener under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. "Sydney, please." The words were written in a frantic, desperate scrawl. I leaned back in my leather chair, reading the contents with the detached, analytical precision of a surgeon reviewing an X-ray. Richard documented his total destruction over the course of 3 chaotic paragraphs. He wrote that Patricia had filed for divorce precisely 9 days after the eviction. The reality of a cheap motel room with stained carpets and a communal microwave had completely broken her. She had packed her remaining clothes into a trash bag and caught a bus to Florida, moving into the spare bedroom of a retired, twice-divorced dentist she used to play tennis with. The letter went on to detail Madison's spectacular fall from grace. Following DeAndre's highly publicized federal arrest, the government had immediately seized his assets, his vehicles, and the luxury penthouse. Madison had been evicted the very next morning. With zero life skills, Zero savings and a completely worthless cryptocurrency portfolio, the former golden child of the Wilson family had been forced to drag her remaining designer suitcases into Richard's cramped, humid motel room. "I am begging you, Sydney," the final paragraph read. "I have no credit. My accounts are frozen. The motel is demanding next week's rent in cash, and Madison will not stop crying. You have the entire trust. You have everything. Just wire me $10,000 to get us back on our feet. You cannot leave your family like this. Please." I reached the bottom of the page. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a rush of vindictive anger. I felt absolutely, profoundly nothing. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting in the corner of my office. I held the notebook paper over the feed slot and let it go. The machine whirred to life with a sharp, aggressive grinding noise. I watched with entirely blank eyes as my father's desperate begging was instantly violently shredded into thousands of tiny, meaningless strips of confetti. I turned back to my desk and sat down. I unlocked my computer terminal and opened the secure encrypted portal for the Theodore Wilson Blind Trust. The total balance of the accounts reflected a staggering multi-generational fortune. I clicked on the outgoing wire transfer module. I routed the destination to a newly established banking account I had finalized the day before. The account was titled the Theodore Wilson Educational Endowment. I typed in the parameters of the fund. It was explicitly designed to provide full unrestricted scholarships housing stipends and aggressive seed capital for brilliant, ambitious young women pursuing degrees in forensic finance and corporate law. It was an organization built specifically to fund women who had been told their entire lives to sit quietly in the background while arrogant, incompetent men took the credit. I moved my mouse to the transfer amount box. I typed in $10 million. I hit authorize. The green confirmation box flashed on the screen, instantly moving a massive fortune out of the trust and into the hands of the future. I closed the laptop, letting out a slow, steady breath. Evelyn's voice crackled through the intercom speaker on my desk. "Ms. Wilson, I apologize for the interruption," Evelyn said, a distinct note of amusement playing in her usually strictly professional tone. "Your 3 o'clock appointment has arrived early. The entire board of executives from the Oak Ridge Country Club is currently waiting in the main lobby." The Oak Ridge Country Club. The same elite, highly restricted establishment where Richard had spent 3 decades smoking imported cigars, drinking expensive scotch, and loudly bragging to anyone who would listen about his immense wealth. "They are sweating profusely," Sydney Evelyn added through the speaker. "Their 50-year land lease expires at the end of the month. They just realized that Grandpa Theodore's blind trust officially holds the deed to the 200 acres of land sitting directly beneath their pristine 18-hole golf course. They are absolutely terrified you are going to raise their rent or bulldoze their clubhouse." I looked through the glass walls of my office out toward the reception area. I could see 4 older men in expensive tailored golf attire, pacing nervously, clutching leather briefcases to their chests. They were the same men who had actively ignored me at every single family dinner, the same men who had laughed at Richard's cruel jokes at my expense. Now their entire legacy depended completely on my signature. "Send them in, Evelyn," I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands neatly on my desk. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "Let us see how much they are willing to pay for their view." The door to my office slid open and I walked directly across the polished concrete floor toward the main boardroom. Inside, 4 men in pristine pastel golf shirts and heavy gold Rolex watches stood abruptly as I entered. I recognized them immediately. Arthur Pendleton, the club president, had spent the last 20 years drinking expensive scotch with my father in our childhood living room. Arthur was the man who deliberately talked over me whenever I tried to contribute to a conversation about finance. He was the man who once patted me on the head and told me to leave the business talk to the men. Now Arthur looked like a man standing on the gallows. His face was slick with a terrified cold sweat. "Ms. Wilson," Arthur began, his voice completely lacking its usual booming bravado. "We appreciate you seeing us on such remarkably short notice. We want to discuss the immediate renewal of the Oak Ridge Country Club land lease. We are prepared to offer a 10% increase on the current monthly rate as a gesture of goodwill. I did not sit down. I leaned forward against the heavy oak conference table, resting my hands flat against the polished wood. I let the silence stretch out, forcing them to squirm under my steady gaze. 10% is an absolute insult, Arthur, I stated, my voice echoing sharply in the acoustic perfection of the boardroom. You are currently paying a rate negotiated by my grandfather in 1975. Market value for 200 acres of prime commercial real estate in this specific district has increased by exactly 800%, but I'm not actually interested in your money. The four men exchanged panicked, desperate glances. Then, what exactly do you want from us? One of the board members asked, his voice trembling slightly. I want you to open your doors, I replied firmly. For 50 years, Oak Ridge has been a fortress of absolute suffocating privilege. You excluded anyone who did not fit your narrow, archaic demographic. You mocked my grandfather behind his back because he worked with his hands even while you played golf on the very land he owned. Here are my non-negotiable terms for the new lease. You will establish and fully fund a comprehensive youth golf and mentorship program for underprivileged kids from the city. They will have full unrestricted access to your facilities, your top-tier instructors, and your dining hall. You will dedicate exactly 30% of your annual operating budget to this initiative. Arthur turned a violent shade of purple. That is completely outrageous, he sputtered, gripping the edge of the table. Our members pay a premium for exclusivity. You will ruin the entire culture of the club. We will lose our most prominent members. You have two choices, Arthur, I replied, my voice dropping to a freezing absolute register that commanded total obedience. You sign this revised lease right now, or I bring in the bulldozers tomorrow morning at exactly 6 o'clock and turn your pristine 18-hole golf course into a public parking garage. Decide right now. The silence in the boardroom was heavy enough to crush stone. Arthur looked down at the lease resting on the table, then looked at the other executives. They had absolutely no leverage. They had no power. They were entirely at my mercy, and they finally knew it. With a shaking hand, Arthur unclipped his gold fountain pen and signed his name on the dotted line. The other board members followed suit in grim, defeated silence. Evelyn will provide your finalized copies, I said cleanly. I turned and walked out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving the great men of Oak Ridge to swallow their massive, bitter slice of humble pie. I stepped back into my private office and let the heavy glass door slide shut, sealing out the noise of the main floor. A massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall was silently playing the local evening news. I reached for the remote and tapped the volume button. The news anchor's crisp, professional voice instantly filled the room. We have breaking news from the federal courthouse downtown, the anchor announced, her face completely serious. Disgraced tech executive DeAndre Vance has just been sentenced to 10 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Vance was found guilty on multiple charges of massive wire fraud, offshore tax evasion, and forging federal estate documents. Authorities have officially seized all of his remaining assets, completely liquidating his Zenith Properties shell companies to pay off his staggering debts. I watched the screen as high-definition footage played of DeAndre being led out of the courthouse. He was wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed securely in front of him, his head bowed in absolute shame. There was no sign of Madison anywhere in the crowd. There was no sign of Richard or Patricia. They had completely vanished into the humiliating obscurity of their cheap, cramped motel room, thoroughly erased from the high society they had worshipped above all else. They were exactly where they belonged. I walked over to the sleek, matte, black bar cart sitting in the corner of my office. I pulled out a heavy crystal flute and popped the cork on a bottle of vintage imported champagne. The golden liquid bubbled and hissed cheerfully as I poured it. I picked up the glass and walked over to my desk. Sitting perfectly centered on the pristine quartz surface was a simple, polished silver frame. Inside was a photograph of Grandpa Theodore. He was standing in front of this very building, back when it was just a dusty, abandoned warehouse. He was wearing his favorite worn tweed vest, his hands resting on his hips, and he was smiling that sharp, knowing smile. He had seen the immense potential in the dirt. He had seen the immense potential in me when my own parents had treated me like a worthless burden. I picked up the photograph and carried it out onto my private balcony. The storm from weeks ago had long passed, leaving the city washed clean. The evening sky was painted in brilliant, vibrant shades of fiery orange and deep purple, reflecting gorgeously off the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown district. The air was cool, crisp, and incredibly clear. I stood at the railing looking out over the massive empire I now controlled. I was completely unburdened. I was entirely untouchable. The weight of my family's toxic expectations was gone forever. I raised the crystal glass toward the photograph of my grandfather, feeling a profound, absolute peace settle deep into my bones. "We did it, Grandpa," I said aloud, my voice carrying into the evening wind. I took a long, slow sip of the cold champagne. I was wealthy. I was victorious. I was finally permanently free. The story of Sydney's triumph over her toxic family teaches a very profound lesson about resilience and self-worth. For years, she was belittled and treated as an outsider by the exact people who should have supported her. Instead of breaking under the weight of their deliberate cruelty, she used their underestimation as fuel to build her own undeniable power. True success does not come from begging for a seat at a table that despises you. It comes from building your own empire and making your own rules. How have you overcome toxic family expectations? Share your story and comment below.